Magnavox's Odyssey goes on sale. VCS games grow up. And Atari's 5200 bets on classics. These stories and many more, and so many more, on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time 40, 30, or 20 years to find out what was making headlines in the video game and home computer industries of yesteryear. Today we're going to be traveling back 40 years to September of 1982. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Ethan. Welcome back, Ethan.
Carl.
Yes?
Can't believe you let me back on the show.
What can I say? You're just such a lovable hunk. I couldn't say no. I couldn't say no to you.
No. Or he just has no one else that will do it. That might be accurate.
No. You are always on the top of my list. Plus, it does make the correction episodes that much sweeter because it means that you didn't catch it either. So.
Well,
I'm just saying. There's an added benefit.
But today we are looking far back into our past, into the deepest recesses of all memory. Yes, 40 years ago. Can you even imagine 40 years ago, Carl?
Sadly, yes. This is really the time when my memories start. So September of 1982, I turned 6 years old. So I clearly remember this. Not only this, I think I even remember the shape of the cake that I got for that birthday. This was the infamous "we're going to McDonald's" birthday, back when they still had the good playgrounds, the one with the grimace steel cage on springs, and you got to climb up to the metal bars of the, a Big Mac police man's mouth. And yeah, it was a real horror show when I think about it. But everybody, they gave us this cake, this McDonald's branded cake with this super sugary frosting. So had a whole bunch of kids eat greasy McDonald's food, eat this super sugary cake, jump up and down in the playground, and on the way home we all barfed.
So this is the image that you should carry forward with you through this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Yeah, I do remember that birthday well. The following year was the really cool one because that was the He-Man shaped cake. But yeah. So
you and He-Man.
I love me my He-Man, man. But we're gonna be mentioning that as well this time. But okay, enough of all that. We have so much to cover today in our count up to the crash that we should probably get started. But always remember, everybody, check out the show notes for all the links on the socials and, of course, on the Patreon. And that includes, of course, if you do become a patron of the show, that you get access to extra cool content. In addition to early access to our interviews, you also get the video version of our first segment, the 7 Minutes in Heaven, where yay, the intrepid co-host must play a game that was reviewed in a magazine dated September 1982 that they have never played before for 7 minutes.
Or more.
Ethan.
Or less.
Well, they have to play it for 7 minutes. Whether or not they choose to go beyond the Call of Duty is a whole different ballgame. And intros don't count because that's not gameplay or something. But, oh well, we're getting off track. We had a lot of big games like Utopia, Pitfall, Berserk on the list today, and Donkey Kong on the ColecoVision. But you've played all of those, so we went with Crichton Masters.
Cytron Master.
Cytron.
You typed it wrong.
Point. I did? Oh, I did. Cytron Masters. So, are you ready, Ethan?
In a manner of speaking.
Excellent. Then, let's get to it. Welcome back, Ethan, from your 7 minutes in heaven. So, for the uninitiated who have not played Cytron Masters, how would you describe the game based on your 7 minutes with it?
So, Cytron Masters is something of a proto-RTS in the sense that you have a base that needs to be destroyed. You can create and determine the motion of units on the screen. The units are set up in various lanes, but it's kind of, you can move it around it like a chessboard. And you kind of direct your units in particular paths in order to breach your opponent's defenses, destroy their ability to create more units, and ultimately overwhelm them through whatever means possible.
Interesting. And this is all taking place in outer space with spaceships, right?
Yes.
It's not ground-based.
It's something of a... I think it was probably a riff to some extent on the Star Trek mainframe basic game. In Star Trek, you can also determine a location for your ship to shoot, and it will shoot along that line, rather than just, you have to guide every single step of the way. So I think that's kind of what they were going for in this.
Interesting. And now you did have one technical issue, that the fact that this requires paddles.
Yes, on the Apple II, they actually came with controllers that had the ability to do analog motion, so you'd be able to determine a certain amount of pressure one way or another, like an analog joystick. And each one is set to either up or down or left or right. And that's how you select things in this. Your cursor is driven by rotating the paddle.
Gotcha. And that did not quite work out in the emulation, I'm guessing.
In the sense that I didn't realize that I could use the mouse. The mouse up and down and left and right actually corresponded to each of the paddles. But when you're using just a digital facsimile by pressing a button to tilt the paddle one way or another, it just instantly goes to the highest amount in that direction.
Gotcha. Now, this game also has a bit of pedigree because of the designer of the game, correct?
Yes. This is a Danny Buntenberry game. Before she was well known for stuff like Mule and Seven Cities of Gold, and kind of the predecessor to what she would later go on to do with Modem Wars. This was one of her first standout games, and is, as I said, very early in what you might call RTS. It's not clear entirely what the resources are, if it's just a thing about time, or you just have to manage how many things you have on the field in order to be able to intercept your various opponents' things and whatnot. But it is a game of strategy that takes place in real time, though you don't control the individual elements in real time.
Gotcha. And so, given your brief time with the game, would you recommend it?
It's a 2-player only game, so in that sense it's hard to recommend. But I think, especially if there was a bit more modernization to it, and maybe the other versions like the Apple and the DOS version have just a little bit more to go for it, then I would recommend it. As it is on the Apple II, though, it is difficult to recommend. I wouldn't say no, but it is quite primitive, and you will have to take some time to understand it.
Gotcha. So it sounds like there are, it's a game you have to put some time into. There's probably a lot of depth there, but it's not going to give you an easy tutorial stage in the modern sense.
Oh, definitely not. Though it does actually have in-game instructions, and you set up things with your paddle and whatnot. So in that sense, it was quite ahead of its time.
This is true. And it also had menu systems. You didn't have to memorize a million different shortcuts.
Indeed. So I think she was taking a lot from, the more action-y games on computers at the time.
Yeah, and I think there's also this idea of usability, of making it accessible in a way that most games of the time, say Ultimas or Wizardries, just did not do.
Yeah, I mean, having a cursor-driven menu interface at that time was incredibly rare. It's not quite GUI, but it allows you to access the deeper functions only using a paddle and a button.
Yeah, and that is very, very forward-thinking. But then again, Button always was very forward-thinking.
Yeah, if you've not seen Modem Wars, you'll be pretty surprised how nobody ever mentions it in terms of RTS. It's just like, oh, Dune 2 happened, and then RTS existed. Modem Wars is...
Yeah, no, Modem Wars is great. I'm agreeing with you, but I'm also like, just like 2 years before Dune 2, we also had War in Middle-earth by Mike Singleton. And I'm not talking about the 16-bit version, I'm talking about the 8-bit versions of the game. It actually was basically RTS-ish.
Well, I'll up you on that one. The Ancient Art of War, published by Broderbund in 1985.
Oh,
That's
another good choice. Yes, definitely.
I am very fascinated with strategy games on computers. Not necessarily that I'm very good at them or I go to them as my main thing, but it is a very underlooked history, and that's why I knew about Cytron Masters.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I also find it fascinating. My interview back in the day with the founder of SSI, just getting the idea of all these guys who love these complex games on boards using the computer to try to not simplify, but to alleviate some of the heavy lifting that normally goes on in strategy games, and making them new in ways that you couldn't, like Fog of War, for example.
Mm-hmm. I was going to bring that up.
Yeah. Well, and he did that in the very first game that he released, the Bismarck game. And so that was something that you just couldn't do before the computer, that adds a new layer of difficulty, if you will, to the whole thing. So, okay, cool. Then we've got that out of the way. I guess the next stop before we can turn on the time machine is to check in with the warden of the Department of Corrections. His name eludes me at this moment. To find out what I got wrong in no, it's not September. What I got wrong in August of 1982.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, before we get started with everything I got wrong in our August 1982 jump, there is...
The Mets! The Mets Comet! Mads, I implore you, never say the phrase Woodies again in reference to Atari consoles. Just don't say it.
Okay, I'll pass that message on.
And I wasn't 100% sure. I think you said there are 2 models of the Atari 2600 at this time. Actually, there are like 4, something like that.
Oh, really?
And then they're about to come out with a new type of model. Because like exteriorly, there's 2 different types. There's a heavy sixer, and then there's the 4 switch. But internally, there's other revisions and things. So
gotcha.
There have been other versions of the VCS to this point.
Hmm. Do you happen to know why the third-party cartridges were not working with the revision that had the difficulty switch on the back?
Nope. I think I casted that around. I did a tweet thread on the same source, and I think somebody said that it was probably just an industrial thing. It didn't necessarily have to do with the electrical stuff.
Oh, okay. Cool.
But I don't know. I don't know if anyone's identified the 2 different types of Donkey Kong Atari 2600 cartridge, however many they made.
Well, that's actually something that theoretically would be a story for September of 1982, but I actually just left it out because there were too many stories. But that's hitting 2 other companies as well, are having problems with the differences between those 2 models.
Oh, Lord. All right, well.
I believe Mattel was one of them as well. Mattel hit that problem with a couple of its games.
The industrial design wars of cartridge patents. People forget about that one. But let us go on into August of 1982. Carl, both wrists out.
Yes, sir. May I have another? Okay.
Beautiful.
Hit me.
All right. So you were speaking about Aladdin's Castle and how long it's been a part of Bally. Aladdin's Castle has been part of Bally since 1974.
Exactly. Yeah. Of
course, a very pioneering company in the mall arcades. They did have another company that they kind of merged into Aladdin's Castle at the same time, called Carousel Time, but it became Aladdin's Castle.
Gotcha. Yeah, for some reason I thought it came a little bit later, but 74, yep, you're right.
Next on, you're wondering about the 5200 to VCS or 2600 converter. It did, in fact, come out.
Okay, yeah, and I just wasn't sure at the time because I hadn't looked it up and it was getting late. So, yeah, cool.
It did indeed.
It will be one of many VCS converters.
Yes, I mean they were already post-dating on the ColecoVision version. Next, the Atari ET arcade game was in fact worked on. I believe that the programmer has been identified. I don't know if there's anything like that really came out of it, but it wasn't that they just said they were doing it. It was actively worked on at one point.
Okay, that's cool.
Don't really know what it would have played like.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, would they have just used the vector hardware from games like Tempest for it at this point? Because that seems to be really big for...
Nah, I wouldn't suspect that. The vector was a very specialized thing. You know, the majority of Atari games coming out were in vector. So I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know that it was worked on. It was not completely never happened.
Gotcha.
Also on ET, you're saying that the announcement shows that they don't have much time to make the game. In the past, Howard Scott Warshaw has pinned a date to it. I don't know how accurate this is. He used to say July 23rd is the date that he was told work on this game. But you know, I don't know if that's exactly true, but July is probably right. They probably did not get the rights in August.
No, but as always with the show, it's appearing in an August dated magazine. So obviously the announcement had to happen earlier, so July makes perfect sense for an August announcement, or at least August dated announcement.
And, he had to get it done in 6 or 6.5 weeks. The story varies because they needed the amount of time to be able to produce it, because making cartridges takes a couple months.
Of course. And for what he achieved, it is not a bad game. Given the time.
I still no. Still no. Not going to relent on that point.
Okay.
Also, speaking of terrible aliens from beyond, the name of the game you were thinking of is Communist Mutants from Space by Star.
That's it. Yeah, I looked it up afterwards. Yeah.
They're notable for more games than that, though. Frogger the official, man. It's the official Frogger.
Well, the big thing for them is that one of the games that they did not actually end up releasing got sort of resuscitated as Epic's summer games.
Well, yes, but in terms of what they were known for at the time, because people didn't really know that this whole thing happened. It's just that we now know because we are historians.
Yes.
Keeping on cartridge things, you were talking about loading into memory, and you're like, oh, they could put more of that on the carts. And no, Carl, you do not put RAM on carts. You don't do it.
Yeah, you couldn't have just put a little bit of RAM on there? Just a little bit? No, just kidding.
It would cost more than the cartridge itself.
This is true.
The memory that is on carts is ROM, not RAM.
Gotcha.
That's why you play your ROMs.
Was this in the context of the well, this was the comparison between the supercharger, which is going to use cassettes, and ROM cartridges.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, what I meant here was that you didn't have to...
What you meant and what you said are two different things, Carl.
Yeah, that you can constantly be going back and grabbing new assets out of the ROM cartridge as you need them during the gameplay. Whereas the cassette would have to load the entire game into the RAM in the supercharger in one hit, and then you're stuck with the maximum amount of space in the supercharger.
Yes, but you did not say that. You're wrong.
Oh, I didn't say that?
On to the next one.
That's what I meant.
You were talking about CP/M, and you said that it only works on a Z80, and that is very inaccurate to say. Just because Z80 was the most popular platform in which CP/M was on, that does not mean it was only on the Z80. I mean, it was on the 86 because they made a version, the CP/M for...
Well, that was CP/M 80. That was CP/M 80 ran on the 8086.
Yes, but you can make a version of CP/M for lots of different things. That's like saying, modern versions of Unix technically only run on 8086 because that's what most people use. It's inaccurate.
Well, yeah, but it's the standard version of CP/M only ran on a Z80. You could make a variation, but they were not fully compatible with one another. That was the big problem with CP/M 80 for the IBM PC. It wouldn't really run almost anything that was written on regular CP/M for a Z80.
Well, because no OS at that time had the ability to do a virtual machine. You had to have an actual physical piece of hardware. And also CP/M was popular on 88 and on Motorola 68000. That's why they later go on to make GEMS for the Atari ST.
Amongst other reasons. Check out my interview with Mr. Trammell to get more insight onto why they went with these guys as opposed to Microsoft. He has a great anecdote about it.
Anecdotes are anecdotes. But also, speaking of this, you were talking about the IBM 5150. The original IBM 5150 ran on an 8086. Did not run on a variation.
Okay,
That
so
is
it
why
wasn't
it is
the
the
8080,
86
it was an
architecture.
8086. Gotcha.
No, it definitely
Okay.
wasn't the 8080. I think they did do kind of a variant version. That might have been like 8088 or something, but yeah, 8086 were the original IBM 5150s.
Okay,
Period.
cool.
Period. Okay. Now the Astrocade patent that you brought up. So
Yeah.
here's the skinny on this. So this patent was for the game Gunfight by Dave Nutting Associates. When they created this game, they needed a way to do the screen because hardly any games before that had a microprocessor-based system to run the screen. They were kind of brute forcing it. And the ways that you can do this is you can either write directly to the screen, and then you have to kind of keep up with the speed of the processor, or you can do something that's called a frame buffer. And that's what this patent is for. In a frame buffer, you are drawing something to the screen at the same time you are storing the information to draw the next frame to the screen.
Yeah.
It was a patent. The idea of the frame buffer is not originally from this patent. It was something developed at Evans and Sutherland, which was the premier place for graphics research. And Jeff Fredrickson, the owner of the patent, knew something about it. So that specific technology for a raster display, or bitmap display, I should say, because raster refers to a lot of different things. A bitmap display that has a frame buffer used in games. Now, the thing is that hardly any other console at the time used this method. They had different methods of doing it. The Atari VCS specifically had the famous racing the beam, or chasing the beam, depending on the way some people say it. So they were not infringing on the patent whatsoever. So that was completely frivolous on that point. And sprite-based systems also do not violate this. So yeah, it was very specific. I mean, it's how things kind of work today, in a sense. But it was for a frame buffer, is what that patent is. Gotcha.
And that's what I couldn't understand from reading the text. But actually, now that you say it, it makes a lot of sense when I put what I did understand from the patent into it, and also explains why they're not really going to succeed against anybody except maybe, but it's only for games. They could go after the IBM PC. The CGA card, I do believe, was using a frame buffer.
Yeah,
but
most graphics cards kind of use a frame buffer idea. Yeah, I think even like all GPUs use a frame buffer, basically.
Exactly.
But Astrocade's going to go under the next year, so it's not going to really help them out.
True.
That bankruptcy case is in Chicago. I need to look at it sometime.
It would be interesting to see who ended up with that patent.
Oh, well, that's on the patent website, I think. But yeah, so Bally sold the patent to Astrocade as part of offloading their inventory, or they had a sub-license rights like Magnavox did for the Sanders Associates patent. Either way, they tried to overstep their bounds. It was never effectively used. Jeff Fredrickson even says that, the frame buffer was used on the NES, and he's wrong. The NES did not have a frame buffer. No.
Had its tile set, but no frame buffer.
Yeah. So it was for a specific place and time. It did not become a very powerful patent.
No. Oh, well.
Now we must talk about corn nuts. Corn nuts are corn, not nuts, Carl.
Oh, okay. I've never had a corn nut before, so.
They are, they're just there. Not much to talk about. Okay, next, the Warner office in New York City that was using technology from Atari. Basically, Steve Mayer, who was originally one of the founders of Cyan Engineering, the advanced R&D group that was bought by Atari in 1974. And that basically became his thing as they were working on Atari Tel. which was a subsidiary of Atari that was trying to make a video phone.
Okay. Interesting.
And they got pretty far with it. I mean, they had working prototypes and everything. And Warner held on to it until 1985, when they sold it to Mitsubishi.
Interesting.
And they did put out a product based on that technology.
Cool. Interesting. Okay, so that it did have a bit of a history, and it's interesting that Warner held on to that segment or that operation for as long as
they
it
definitely
did.
saw it as something that they could work with. And I know that Steve Mayer has talked about, that they had very high hopes for what they were going to do, but ultimately it didn't really fit into their business. They were not a communications company, even though they were called Warner Communications.
Oh, well. Okay, let's move on. We got a couple more.
Another Warner advanced project thing. So in Superman 3, the graphics thing were put together by the former head of the home software group, Steve Wright. He headed up that project to make the Superman 3 kind of pixely graphics, but not all of that was computer generated. Some of it is just kind of cutting out things and making it kind of look like it's a computer. And also, as I understand, they also made more of it than they actually put in the film as well.
Yeah, and I actually spoke with. Did I talk? Yeah, I talked to Steve Wright. Unfortunately, I lost about 30 minutes of the interview. It was a 2.5-hour interview, but I couldn't really save it, so I have chunks of it on my hard drive, so it'll never see the light of day. But we talked specifically about it, and he said that he actually rendered that on a especially made bespoke
you did say that.
hardware. Yeah.
You did say that in the thing. I think it is a PDP of some sort. But I think you kind of you garbled it a little bit. It's like, this is how they tested whether or not they were going to do these arcade games. It's like when the developers were making arcade games, they just took an idea and they prototyped it on their system right there, and then they would go off and then make it official on something else. But a couple of those graphics on Superman 3 are not actually completely computer rendered. That's all I wanted to say.
Gotcha. Of course. A little bit of fidgeting is always good.
The last story of your lot, as the founding of High Toro comes into picture. Kaplan did not leave to work with Nolan Bushnell. He left to work with Chuck Peddle, who had left Commodore. Yes, they were doing a speech related computer speech related enterprise.
Okay. Why did I think he had gone off to Bushnell? I guess I stored some or cross-wired someplace in my brain.
He may have. I can't remember his full history thing. He's a very waffly guy. I think he'll admit that to you. But he might have done it. He might have done it. He went back to Atari. After that as well, and then maybe he went to go work for Axon or something. He got around. Larry Kaplan, co-founder of Activision. Well, no, he's not a co-founder of Activision. Larry Kaplan, one of the gang of four, got around.
Yeah. He shows up in a lot of different places. But okay, so was that it?
That
for August of 82?
Is what we will do for August of 1982, and I will see you next time. You can lift your arms up now, Carl.
Woohoo!
I'll see you next time for
Excellent.
August of 1992.
As always, Ethan, thank you for your service.
Bing! Carl, I'm not playing this game anymore. It was me all along.
With the candlestick in the sitting room?
No, you dummy. It was obviously with the wrench in the chandelier room.
The chandelier room.
Yes, just a room full of chandeliers.
Okay, the chandelier room. Okay. Good. It was you. I'll stick with that. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. Clue references. They never get old. Okay, so before we can, let's turn on the time machine, but before we can go back 40 years, we have some big news from 50 years ago. So let's head back to September of 1972.
Oh, wait, I got a sound effect.
Oh.
1972.
I dig it. So, Ethan, what's our first story?
Magnavox goes on sale. But the company? The entire company goes on sale? Is that what you're implying?
It's just the headline. It's artistic license here.
I'm very particular about making sure it's called the Odyssey, because it's not called the Magnavox Odyssey.
Did you not hear the headline where I said Magnavox's Odyssey? I made sure it was an apostrophe S. So, Magnavox has launched their groundbreaking electronic marvel, the Odyssey. And for those not in the know, this is the very first home gaming console. And for those who are just now joining us, we just did a special, nearly 3 hour long.
Over 3 hours.
The recording time. Once I cut out some of the stuff, it came out to just under 3 hours, I think. Or was it longer? I don't know.
No, it was. I have it downloaded.
With it.
It's over 3 hours.
It's 3 hours. So over 3 hour long special on 50 years of the Magnavox Odyssey, its creation, its impact, the lawsuits. Oh, so many lawsuits.
That's the fun stuff.
Yeah, so if you want to know more about the Magnavox Odyssey and its launch, please go check out that special. Grab a drink and enjoy. So, I think we've talked enough about that in the last few days that we do not need to do that again. Next story.
Time Out incorporates.
Mall arcade chain Time Out has incorporated. The chain, started in 1970, will survive up through to the 90s.
After getting bought and stuff.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about it actually starting in 1970. I went pretty deep on trying to find the origins of mall arcades, including Aladdin's Castle and whatnot. I think they're a little bit later than they normally say they are. Like I've looked up stuff like Kingdom of Oz and other ones in that general area. So Aladdin's Castle might be 68 or 69, and I really think that they are the example of the mall arcade. So it takes a couple years for other people to pick up on that idea.
Yeah, and I'm using the 1970 date comes from. What's the name? The Arcade Blogger.
He's not great on research. Okay,
that's good to know. So I'm blaming it on him, and as soon as we have a better.
But the incorporation is correct.
The incorporation is correct. So there we go. We've got an actual source for that. Thanks to you, Ethan. And so now we've got the start of this. So it's at the very beginning of video games. I mean, really, there's only one of them at this point in the arcades. But we're seeing that these are already proliferating and will be able to profit from the boom because they're already there.
Yeah, I mean, I've written about the fact that the mall arcades were kind of well positioned to take advantage of the video game boom. You can link that article in the show notes.
I'm sure that you'll send me the link and I will put it in there.
Computer Space was a success, is the name of it.
Yes, and we've talked about it here on the show before as well. So yeah, as soon as video really takes off, they're already there just waiting for that cash cow. Okay. Then let's turn on the time machine again, jump forward 10 years for our 40-year jump, September of 1982.
Knowledge is 1982.
Electronic video games.
Entertainment business sales have been generally lackluster. There is so much money to be made.
Welcome to September of 1982. Ethan, what's our first story?
New penalties for copyright infringement signed into law.
Ronald Reagan has signed into law the Piracy and Counterfeiting Amendment Act of 1982, which ups the ante for pirates, including fines of up to $250,000 and prison terms of up to 5 years for those found guilty for a second or subsequent time of illegally copying an audiovisual work. First-time offenders creating between 7 and 65 copies during a 180-day period can get fined $25,000 and spend up to a year in prison.
Obviously, something that they kind of needed to put on the books, but I don't think very broadly enforced. People always say these things about piracy. It's like, this grandma was downloading a song and then the record company sued her for $100 million or whatever. But it doesn't happen that often. This isn't enforced really that hard. But on the end of, how manufacturers think of it, it's a positive change.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that's mainly there to scare people from doing too much of this. And we do already this month get the first major bust under the new law. And it comes from a year-long FBI operation that seizes $200,000 worth of pirated equipment, video game equipment here in New York and New Jersey. The illegal operation was run by notorious gangster Myron Sugarman.
Sugarman.
Yeah,
he was very involved with Bally for a long time.
Exactly. He also wrote a memoir. I think it's called The Last Jewish Mobster.
Yeah.
And he's done a bunch of interviews, and I think I'll link to one of the interviews in the show notes where he talks about how Bally basically was a mob-run organization.
That's not quite what he says.
He says that the mob comes in and buys the place,
but that's not exactly accurate in terms of what went on. Alex went and read his book, and he took some of what Sugarman said, but it was not entirely run by the mob. It had investment of known mafia figures.
Yeah. That's a nice way of putting it.
There is a difference.
I know. And he also talks about how he was running slot machines in Africa for them and all sorts of stuff. So, fun stuff. But he's the one who gets caught here with these pirated, basically illegal copies of games. There's Pac-Man and a few others in the mix. Obviously this is, it's 1982. It's the arcade market is still hot for the big popular games, and these guys were just basically getting pirated copies of these boards out there. So, but this new law already applies because they make the sting after the law goes into effect.
Yeah, so in other legal news, we have restrictions, fee hikes, permits, and bans.
Every conceivable type of legal reaction to the moral panic caused by video games is being brought to bear against coin-op games in the United States. The number of suggested laws is just mind-numbingly large and too extensive to discuss here, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel as several bans have been challenged in court on the grounds of them being unconstitutional, limits of free speech, or just downright unfair, and the ACLU is starting to get involved.
Someone definitely needs to do a book examining the arcade restrictions across the United States, both from a legal and political perspective. I would love to read something like that.
I think it would be extremely interesting. I don't know how many of the actual language of the proposals have survived, just because a lot of this stuff is being done on a very, very local level. So
but that would be saved in a local jurisdiction in most cases.
Maybe. I don't know if they're keeping records for 40 years.
I mean, from the 80s, things got pretty solidified in that sense. It's way more difficult to find something from the 70s than from the 80s. But that's a thing about research. But yeah, there is a greater story here, and I don't think it's just that people are mad because they think video games is going to drive everyone crazy. There's a lot of stuff about zoning laws and what is really the impact of having recreation in certain areas of a city or town. I think there's a lot of interesting arguments that can be tackled.
Oh, there's a ton of stuff. And a lot of it also has to do with something we talked about a few months ago. The Reagan administration had changed the rules for, I think it was called redistribution. So it used to be that a lot of money went from the states back to the federal government, and the federal government would then redistribute that money back. So sometimes you'd have states that were paying more in than they were getting back, and vice versa. And this is one of the major reasons why suddenly costs for a university start spiraling out of control. Because what in reality the conservative hype was, the states they're losing money, but in reality what was really happening with redistribution is the states would give money to the federal government. The federal government would pad that money when it came back, giving them more money back than they actually put in. And this is where the universities start seeing their budgets slash, because the money that they were getting from their states was actually this redistribution money from the federal government. And so everybody, all of these services, all of these localities that used to get federally supported money from their states are now tackling these massive budget defaults. Or the budget holes at the same time that the economy is in a downturn, so the tax collection is also down. And in a lot of these restriction stories, all these people are talking about how the coin-op guys are making all this money, and they need to make they want a piece of that action. They're like, they're not paying their fair share. They're making money off of our kids. We need this money back. And that's why a lot of these fee hikes are just astronomical. They want like $250 or $300 per machine per year, when the machine itself is, barely breaking even with the increasing cost of hardware equipment. So it is a really weird time, but a lot of the budget and local government budget structures that we have today in the United States are directly linked to this time period. And anti-arcade game legislation is in part just a reaction to that federal financing change.
All right, you've given your civics lesson for the day.
Sorry, yes.
I think that
I just think it's so interesting.
There are also other objections and things. I remember I read one story that was like, and this does go into budget, but at the same time, it is in part these public places, these places of amusement are things that a community needs to agree on to have in their area. At least that's how it kind of works in the United States. So there was one story that I saw where they canceled doing a recreation area that seniors could enjoy, and they decided to put in an arcade, and so there was a protest.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where and the arcades themselves as businesses are easier to zone and to regulate. Where it gets really weird from a zoning standpoint is the individual machines being put into restaurants and convenience stores and gas stations and so forth, because that's not the principal purpose of the business. And so this is why the zoning laws go after arcades, family entertainment centers, and the like. But when you start having the games just everywhere in laundromats and stuff, that's when zoning loses its power to control, and that's when the licensing of the machines or outright bans of the machines in cities, because there's a lot of those as well, those kick in. And that's when it gets into the free speech and constitutional protections, because what you're really saying is a certain type of speech is suddenly not possible, whereas just saying, hey, we're not putting an arcade here, that falls under zoning, and you can get away with that in a much easier way through the federal courts.
So there are some tricky times ahead for arcade operators, and another big problem coming is distributors aren't accepting trade-ins.
Traditionally, operators of coin-op games could count on being able to trade in their old equipment towards the purchase of new games at their distributors. This worked because the distributors could sell the older games onto rural areas, but the increased publicity about games has quieted the appetite of rural gamers for older games and made them just as demanding for the latest and greatest games on the market. This change is causing the financial investment in new equipment for operators to increase dramatically, just as revenues per machine due to massively increased competition is squeezing their margins.
All right, let me break this down a little bit further for the audience's sake. So, a operator of coin-op games, they do not just have a single place that they put games. They have several different locations, whether it's, an arcade or a convenience store or whatever. And this was the case for a very long time. It still is, in that sense. But so an operator is the business guy who puts the machine in the location. Sometimes he owns the location, a lot of times he doesn't. So he puts in a pinball machine in the classic parlance, and then it makes money there for whatever amount of time, and then he moves that pinball machine, which he got brand new, now it's used, he can move it to another location of his. And they kind of rank these locations in terms of how much money they can make, an A, B, C, D location.
Yeah.
So they move it further and further out where they know they're going to get less money. And then at the end of all of that, after it's made however much money it's going to make, a cycle which back in the day took years, literal years, you could have a single pinball or any kind of game out on location. Then you could trade it into the distributor for some money back.
Yeah, and the distributor would then sell it off to a rural area. And that rural area, since they didn't know if it was a new game or an old game, because there were no magazines publishing this stuff, there were no television shows talking about it, then they'd be happy with the older equipment, and there'd be an operator out in the boonies who'd be like, yeah, okay, for this amount of money, I'll buy it, run it into the ground, and it's not a problem. And now, though, with video and with television talking about the games and magazines coming out, the people in the rural area, they don't want to wait 3 years to play Pac-Man. They want Pac-Man now. And so this has now killed the market for these older machines as used equipment in podunk backwater areas. And
I think that it is just knowing about the games is not really the big factor. Because, there's a lot of talk about what is kind of causing this squeeze. I think that it has way more to do with how the style of games have evolved, and then therefore they just had less of a shelf life.
Well, that's the thing. There's technology coming out. If you know what the latest game looks like or have heard about it, you're not going to be happy with the 3-year-old game, which literally seems like generations older hardware and design.
But I don't technology, I fought against you on this in the past. I don't think technology is the sole determinant in what people think is interesting in games.
Well, of course, technology isn't, but the technology does allow for more complex gameplay. So, for example, you're not going to be running Pac-Man off of Space Invader hardware. But Space Invader, if you look at the length of time, like you said, you used to be able to put a pinball machine in there for years. Space Invaders came out, 78, 79? At this point? 78. Okay. So Space Invaders is 4 years old at this point. If you were going to put Space Invaders someplace, there's not that big of an audience for Space Invaders at this point anymore. I mean, yes, some people will still play it. The Atari VCS version has sold really, really well, but it is a relatively simplistic game as opposed to something like Donkey Kong, which from a technological standpoint, from a sophistication of the gameplay standpoint, is pretty much the top of the line at this point in the arcades. So
at this point, we're already a year out from Donkey Kong, so there's way more interesting stuff.
It's 82. 82. Donkey Kong is 82.
No, it's 81. You covered this. This was exactly a year ago.
Exactly a year ago. Okay.
September 1981. Yep.
You're right. The Coleco version is already out, and Donkey Kong Jr. is already out. You're right. 81. Okay. So Donkey Kong Jr. Let's say there's just too much going on, and this is coming straight out of Playmeter. This is how they're describing it. This market is completely dissolved. Now there is a backup market, if you will, because Mexico had also become a profitable secondary market for older coin-op games, but they too now are no longer interested in outdated games, and the Mexican government has begun cracking down on what they see as nuisances and have levied tough importing fees, creating an illegal import market.
The Mexican market is they tried to develop the Mexican market in the late 80s, early 90s as well, and it's known for having only illegal stuff come in, and you've covered that on with the Street Fighter 2 clones and whatnot. But there have been circumstances where they've been able to develop the Mexican market. It's not entirely rural, obviously, So
oh no, it's Mexico City. I mean, at this point in time, is the most populous city on the planet. I mean, they have a lot of urban stuff in Mexico. It's just, it was like, okay, where else can we sell this stuff cheap? And they're running out of places to go, especially when you also consider how many machines they suddenly have to get rid of. There's just so many more machines out there. It's scary.
You want to talk cheap? Let's talk Atari. Atari coin-op cuts manpower.
Atari has imposed a 4-day work week and moved an unspecified number of coin-op manufacturing workers to other areas of the company as the summer slump begins to worsen. Atari claims that sales are slower due to the typical summer slump, but this follows slowdowns at Sega and other manufacturers as well.
As mentioned on the show before, it was right in this summer that the bottom was falling out. They didn't have demand anymore. Distributors didn't want any more games. Like literally, in market terms, in the summer of 1982, sales of new machines stopped.
Yeah. Well, and this is what we were just talking about with the with the sale of old equipment. The distributors don't even know what to do with all the machines anymore, both new and old. It's, what are they going to do buying your old machine in order for you to take the new one off their hands, and then they just have more inventory they can't get rid of. And everybody just wants the latest and greatest game, and Atari has released a couple of relative dogs lately. It's been a hot minute since they had the top game on the market.
Yeah, they're not doing great, and they really go on sequels and spiritual sequels and whatnot. Another interesting thing about the manufacturing at Atari is right around this time there's a glassworking union that starts to try and work its way into Atari to try and get them to unionize. There's an old TV clip of this as well, and I don't know if this was in reaction to this or if it was happening already before it, but I know that some people at Atari were like, they literally have nothing to do with us. We don't need a glassworking union to come in here to represent our people on the floor. So that might have been a response to these cuts in work weeks, and they would try to impose a full work week, but the people are going to get cut. I mean, you'll be talking about it soon.
Oh yeah, like I said, the crash is coming, and it's coming for everybody.
I mean, that's a separate crash, but there has been a crash in another coin-op market. Stern gets out of pinball.
With the market for silver ball entertainment continuing to soften, Stern Electronics has decided to at least temporarily cease production of pinball machines and instead move completely into video games. Great timing.
Oh, poor Gary. Gary can't catch a break.
No, he can't. Now, just for clarification, this is not the same Stern pinball that most people will be familiar with from the 90s and early 2000s.
Even though Wikipedia will tell you so, they're wrong. Very wrong.
It's a different company and also a different generation of the Stern name.
No,
right?
I mean, Gary is running the company, is running Stern Electronics, and then he runs Stern Pinball. His father, Sam Stern, was involved with Stern Electronics, but he did not actually run the place.
Okay. They just used his dad on a lot of advertising and promotional materials.
Yeah, there's that, but he was basically just kind of the sage man in the corner kind of thing.
Yeah.
Didn't really have anything to do with him.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, but just as video is going nowhere, they're like, yeah, let's do this instead of pinball.
Obviously, they've already been in video. They've been importing the Konami stuff, and they've been doing Berserk and its sequels and a couple other interesting games that people kind of forget about. So it's not like it was, all the other pinball companies have already moved out of it. Like when Stern Electronics was established, Gary Stern said, "This is a pinball company." He said that to the press. He's like, we are going to make pinball. But they just had to acquiesce to the realities. You can listen to our special on 1980 AMOA to get a little bit of that.
Oh, of course. But the problem is their timing of this. Had they done this a year earlier, maybe. But they're going all in at the wrong moment.
It could have been made the right moment if manufacturers had done a little something particular to help themselves out.
And that would have been?
How about conversion kits? Replay adds conversion kits to their annual equipment guide.
In a sign of the changing market for coin-operated games, trade publication Replay has, for the first time, added conversion kits to its annual equipment guide issue. With the slow summer that we've talked about a few times over the last few months having spooked some in the industry, the cheaper upgrade kit solution may be just what the market needed. Whether or not distributors will play along is anyone's guess, though.
I do find it interesting that the publication seemed to be pushing in this direction where distributors are still resisting. By the end of this year, they're gonna get it. Specifically due to one particular game.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that's Burger Time?
No. Mr. Do.
Which game? Oh, you're right, Mr. Do. Okay, yeah, now, for those who haven't been following, again, just a quick primer, the coin-op business is a three-tier business. You have the manufacturers, they sell machines to the distributors, and the distributors then sell them to the operators, who are the ones who set them up and collect the coins. Now, the distributors see conversion kits, as we've said a few times already, as a threat to them because, it's just a couple of boards. You can, in theory, if you make it easy enough, anybody can install them. And so the distributors are a little worried that they might either lose out on sales of the big cabinets or just lose out on sales altogether if the manufacturers can sell directly to the operators. And so they're really not in on it. But I think it's not surprising that the magazines are pushing this, due to the fact that if you look at who's buying the issues of the magazine, especially the largest percentage of the issues of the magazine, it's the operators. So if they took a stance that was a stance that really only the distributors found interesting, then they would actually be turning their back on the majority of their readers, who are the operators.
There has always been a bit of a power struggle between distributors and operators for who really gets to guide the changes within the coin-op industry. And that's a story that's kind of unwritten. Though I am, in my book, going to talk rather extensively about the conversion kits because Sega, Gremlin, was one of the few companies that went full in on it. They were the only big manufacturer going full in on it, though, so they kind of became isolated. And then there were these kind of minor companies like CVS and whatnot that were trying to muscle their way into it as well. But it just wasn't taking hold.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this just last 30-year jump in 1992 when Capcom released Champion Edition, Street Fighter II Champion Edition, only as a standalone cabinet in North America. I mean, even 10 years later, this idea that, well, everything as a conversion kit is still not omnipresent. Granted, they have to immediately acquiesce and give in because of the
after this little period where the conversion kit was really needed, the conversion kit kind of disappears. It becomes an extremely minor part of the market. And that's not just because of the hang-ons and all that kind of stuff. People were just buying full cabinets again. And then in the late 80s, they went back to buying kits.
Well, I think maybe a lot of that also had to do with JAMA finally creating their standard, which made the implementation of the conversion kits that much easier.
It still took a few years, so there's interesting things with the ebbs and flows of the market. But with the people who were already on the conversion kit train, they did not help themselves, particularly Sega Gremlin. Let us first talk about one of their games, which was not conversion kit available, Zaxxon. Ad goes national.
Sega has expanded the airing of its TV ad for the Zaxxon arcade game nationally and has tried to air it during all manner of shows such as Saturday Night Live, baseball games, and Different Strokes. And this is one that we talked about a couple of episodes ago. This is this very elaborate ad for an arcade game, which, is kind of weird. And it's using 3D graphics, actual 3D computer graphics, CGI.
Able and Associates, the same people who did Tron.
Exactly. Well, one of the companies that did Tron.
Yeah, one of them.
Yeah. And it's really, really cool. The link is in the show notes of it in case you haven't seen it. And last time we talked about this had only been aired in California in a couple of markets, and now they've expanded it nationally.
And Sega has another big idea to bring people into the arcade. Sega brings 3D to the arcade.
Sega's latest game, Sub-Rock 3D, a first-person flight action game using sprite scrolling, creates a 3D illusion through a spinning disc effect which would later be used for the Master System 3D glasses.
It's not a flight action game. It is a submarine shooting game.
Oh, okay. I couldn't figure out because it did have some altitude control on it.
Yeah,
with the
that's
horizon
for the periscope. Moving. I have played a working Sub-Rock 3D.
Oh, really?
Yes.
There is such a thing still out there.
Yep, Galloping Ghost.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was not working last time I was there. And though actually, no, it wasn't at Galloping Ghost. It was at another Illinois arcade. So their version didn't, if they had that, whatever, I've played it. It was out of alignment, so the 3D didn't exactly work spectacularly. And even if it was, I don't really see the grand appeal of this game is very much a shooting gallery game, except everything's coming at you a million miles an hour.
Yeah, and it's weird because it uses some of the same old school electromechanical shooting gallery technology, like the targeting reticule isn't on the screen. It's actually it's just basically blended in through a separate light onto the glass that you're looking through onto the screen. And apparently they also knew that the whole 3D glasses thing was prone to breakage because the ROMs actually have a option that you can turn it off.
Heck.
Yeah, I found a video where a guy looks through the entire machine and shows it off on a unit where the 3D glasses didn't work, and he actually shows that function that an operator could turn it on and off.
So the 3D effect was actually not something Sega did in-house. It was actually something that they got from Matsushita.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's reports on this in some of the other magazines. So they partnered with them for that. It is part of this kind of legacy of Sega kind of combining stuff from electromechanical elements and their video games. It's an evolution of the hardware that was used on Turbo and will later be used on Buck Rogers Zoom 909, Buck Rogers
Planet of Zoom.
Well, it has two different names. In Japan, it's Zoom 909. So, and this is again something I explore a little bit more thoroughly in the book that will eventually exist. But
now, is it actually using sprite scaling, or is it just using a variety, multiple versions of the same sprite at different sizes?
I mean, it's not. Sprite scaling is that in a lot of different instances. But I think it is a form of sprite scaling, but it's very rudimentary. In the sense that they're kind of faking it. Because they're kind of using an analog signal interference to make them larger or smaller. I've seen a kind of technical breakdown of what it is in Turbo, and I'm astounded because it is very weird.
Yeah, Turbo is a very messed up looking one. Now this, I didn't get the same effect that I had it with Turbo here, but it may be the same thing. I just didn't see it, or they've refined it a little bit. Curiously enough, this game actually gets a home port. There is a home port for
they just call it Sub-Rock
Vision. Yeah, but still, it's like it's such a mind-numbingly simple game, and why you would have this as a home port, I have no idea. But
the reason I really don't like it is that I hate games where you can't tell if the missile's going to hit you or not. And this happened in a lot of like 2D games that had kind of these 3D things coming at you. And if you were able to tilt something like Danger Zone by Cinematronics and whatnot, all these games are really annoying to me. So I do not recommend Sub-Rock 3D.
No, it's problematic. But oh well.
All right, I have no transition to the next one. There's no way to do it. So Bushnell to return to game making.
Nolan Bushnell has announced in an interview that his non-compete clause with Atari ends in 1983, and he intends to get right back into it. I don't think, quote, I don't think the spectacle aspect of video games has been exploited enough. Bigger than life situations are an important trend, end quote. The company would be called Sentai and would begin by making games for Chuck E. Cheese.
For the background on this, so when Nolan Bushnell sold Atari to Warner Communications in 1976, he signed, as is a typical thing when you have a big corporate buyout like this, he had to sign a clause that said, I will not enter a directly competing business for 7 years. And they did that purchase in October, or effective in October. So in October of 1983, he will be able to re-enter game manufacturing.
Yes. And Chuck E. Cheese was not a direct competitor to Atari, and that's why he was able to run this. And Sentai is going to produce games. But the first thing that they're actually going to make is a skee ball game for Chuck E. Cheese. And if you want to hear more about Sentai, check out my interview with Roger Hector. Right now it's still only up on the Patreon. So if you're a patron, you can go and check that out right now. It'll be up on the regular feed at some point next year. So yeah, that's very interesting to find out everything that was going on. Hector had been at Atari before that, knew a lot of the players at Sentai, and it goes into some interesting stories about that period.
Sentai is a pretty complex company, and what Bushnell says here isn't really what they did in terms of a thing with spectacle. They didn't really. They made a couple games that had kind of like hydraulic movement and whatnot, but that wasn't really their thing. Their thing is that they made a hardware system and produced games that you would be able to interchange onto that hardware system. The Sentai system was one of the first robust hardware systems out there.
Yeah, and it's very much a sign of. It's primarily meant for Chuck E. Cheese's, so that's one thing, and it's coming after the arcade crash. So it's very much embracing that idea of, okay, we need lots of games, they need to switch out often, and they can't be too expensive. There
will be some more interesting things to cover with Sentai when you get there, but you got another year, basically, when we get, because it's a very unknown story, but there's a lot more to it that I think is interesting.
And like I said, I spoke to Roger Hector in great detail about it. It's a good interview. Everybody should check it out.
All right, speaking of hucksters, let's talk some high score maniacs. Pac-Man screen breaks.
In what may be the first documented case of someone reaching the now infamous split screen or kill screen on Pac-Man, Eric Schwibs, an 18-year-old, hit almost 3 million points in Patrick's Pub in Orchard Park, New York, when the screen split and he couldn't continue his game.
Orchard. That's how we say it out east.
Orchard.
Orchard.
Yeah,
are you making fun of my accent?
Not your accent. Just all those accents. Not yours in particular.
So the kill screen on Pac-Man, it has a very controversial history. Mainly because the particular person who gets credit for being the first to do it is absolutely not the first to do it. And this one you pulled up may not be the first. I haven't done the research on this. Kat Despira has. She has pulled up various examples of some are fully confirmed, some are not fully confirmed. The Pac-Man kill screen was definitely known in this time period. People had mastered it enough to get to that.
Gotcha. Yeah, this is why I said it may be the first documented case. It's the first one that I've come across in the magazines and newspapers, and it does get reported in a couple of different places. By the time the source that I'm using is Video Games Player magazine. And it's the first issue in fall of 1982, so it's very likely that they're getting this from some local newspaper or something, so it's definitely before this. And remember, everybody, we're using the cover dates on magazines, so everything happened at some point before September of 1982. And it's interesting also, this guy goes on to become a meteorologist for the National Weather Service. So if you look up Eric Schwibs, you'll find him quoted on all sorts of things when storms happen in the Northeast and stuff. His name will pop up.
That reminds me, the guy who first beat Dragon's Lair is now like an environmental lawyer.
Sounds perfectly reasonable to me.
But on Pac-Man news, Midway sues Pac-Man Guidebook makers.
Midway has followed through on their threat to pursue legal action against those publishers releasing books about how to beat games like Pac-Man. And we talked about that, I think, last month already. So one such case against Publications International Limited for their book How to Win at Pac-Man saw the publication fail to get a declaratory judgment that the Pac-Man trademark and copyrights were invalid and not infringed, but failed, and they were enjoined from continuing to publish the book, but could sell off the 500,000 copies they had in stock as negotiations between Midway and the publisher had gone on for 6 months. Once the case went to trial, though, the judge found that Midway's defense that there were licensed guidebooks was not strong because those books were far inferior to the book in question. Together with several other similar cases, ultimately the courts would get to the finding that the recreation of copyrighted material, like screenshots, will only be allowed to the extent necessary to educate and provide scholarship about the game, but may not be used without permission on cover or filler pages to simply act as an attraction to purchase the book.
This case was actually filed in Chicago. I did look it up, and there's no paperwork for it left. I don't know if, maybe it went into another jurisdiction or something. The one interesting thing of this is that Publications International Limited was owned by Gulf and Western, which is the company that owns Sega at this moment.
Yes.
So that was the interesting part for me. That's kind of why I wanted to look to see what might have been done. But this is a pretty basic trademark infringement issue. It's like, can you promote something on the basis of somebody else's trademark if you're supplementing it in some way, but doesn't work out.
Yeah, this is the beginning of this understanding that it's okay and a valid argument to have books of scholarship, that the licensed guidebook is not a derivative product from the original. So normally if you have the copyright to something, all derivative products are covered by that copyright. So if Bram Stoker writes Dracula, nobody else can come in and make a movie about Dracula as long as the copyright on the original book is still active. Exactly. Enter Nosferatu. So you have this situation where Pac-Man, a guidebook to how to beat Pac-Man, is now no longer there. The judge is basically saying that's not a derivative product. What you're dealing with here is scholarship. You're dealing with somebody trying to understand and educate. And that lifts that veneer. Then now you can publish these books. What you can't do, and this is where they get into trouble, is basically, promote the book or use the copyrighted material to sell the book. So you can say, you put on the cover, How to Win at Pac-Man. You just can't put Pac-Man on the cover. And if you show images of the game, you can only be for the purposes of winning. You can't have, and I think this book had this, a bunch of color insert pages in the middle showing off the game and the cabinet and stuff like that. Those don't educate anybody about the game. They're just there to attract buyers. So that's why this book basically loses. But the fundamental idea of a guidebook on how to win at the games is going to be permissible.
A lot of these guides do decide to just do illustrations of how the things work rather than the patterns and whatnot, rather than have screenshots and overlay arrows on top of that.
Well, also at this point in time, getting those screenshots is not that easy.
Yes, there is that as well. Now, you would be surprised on some of these things, some of these magazines, some of these books, I see screenshots like those look perfectly flat. I do not even see a curve. How were you able to do that?
There's a couple of different ways you can pull that off.
All right, we're not going to go into that.
Right
Next
lenses,
Pac-Man piece of news. Pac-Man cartoon debuts. Ugh.
On September 25th, Hanna-Barbera's Pac-Man cartoon debuted, ushering in a slew of video game-based cartoons on Saturday mornings, solidifying the character in the public consciousness in an even wider way than he already was, as well as inspire the game Pac-Land, the first big breakout side-scrolling jump and run.
All right, I want to talk about this. Okay, next story.
Okay, and I just wanted to mention a couple of things, because this is still the period of time when the TV season, you only had the 3 networks in the United States, so this is American television here. When they started a new season, the fall season started, it's like all the new shows start the same week. There's no, staggered, this comes out here, this comes out there and stuff. This is still the period when I think it was NBC would actually send out to all the television journalists and stuff a towel each year with the entire fall calendar. Like the weekly schedule of shows would be printed on this towel, because it was like, this
Never
is how
forget your
secure
towel.
it is. Well, that too. And if there were any changes, they'd send like a little, washcloth afterwards or something. But a couple of other big shows that featured computer technology or gaming also debut. So we've got Knight Rider debuts the same week. Talking car run by an AI, with the famous moment with David Hasselhoff playing a game using an Atari joystick, VCS joystick in the car. Silver Spoons, which is about man-child, rich boy who suddenly discovers he has a kid and has to take care of the kid, and he's got the main set was a giant playroom with a bunch of arcade cabinets in it, and that was a constant storyline of him playing the games. So there's a couple of shows that are really showing the fascination of people with this computer and gaming technology, and how it's permeating even things like mainstream television at this time. Sorry, I wanted to mention that.
You're not going to convince me that the Pac-Man cartoon is good, Carl, no matter what you say.
I didn't say it was good. I'm just saying 6-year-old Carl watched it every week. So 6-year-old Carl thought it was cool, even though 6-year-old Carl had never actually played Pac-Man at this point in his life.
Okay, we're moving on. Coleco breaks quarterly earnings record.
Coleco's second quarter, ending June 30th, was their best quarter ever, with net sales of $86.8 million, a 51% increase over 1981's second quarter. Earnings almost doubled from $4 million to $7.4 million.
Sounds like some money.
Yeah, but think about it. This is the second quarter for a toy company. This should not be the best quarter they've ever had.
Coleco has had a
Christmas quarter.
Yeah, they were always a weird toy company because of how they sold stuff. But
yeah, still,
I mean, they in recent years they had their record quarters, and now they're breaking it again.
Yeah, and this is all before the ColecoVision sales come into the picture. This is just the tabletop little games and stuff like that that's really pushing these sales. Now, Coleco always had a big summer business as opposed to other toy companies because of the water toys and stuff, but this is a quarter that ended June 30th, so even that isn't 100% the story at this point. Now, an interesting little side note here that Tonka also reports their numbers, and they had a massive loss of $2.9 million for the first half of the year, as opposed to $2.1 million profit in the same time period the previous year. And their orders are way down.
Tonka is one of the few big toy companies of the time that does not get into video games. They do later when they distribute the Master System in the US, but Tonka and Hasbro stay out of video games entirely in this time period.
Exactly. And it's a good example of how the video games are sucking money away from other toys at this point.
Let us talk a bit about that.
Yes.
ColecoVision gets nearly 500,000 orders.
Coleco has announced that it has already received orders for more than 450,000 units of the ColecoVision, with Donkey Kong's amazing graphics being the big draw. First shipments of the console began in late July.
By the end of the year, they are going to ship 550,000 units. This is a number that was very solidly put into the press. It was all they could make because they didn't have the capacity to be able to make more than that.
Exactly. And so this is a huge success for them. I mean, it's going to be pushing their earnings even higher. We'll probably talk about it here on the show as those numbers become available.
There's another thing that Coleco is doing to get so much success, because while Atari bets on classics, Coleco taps into the arcade.
Nice. With both Coleco and Atari releasing top-of-the-line next-gen systems almost simultaneously, the contrasting software strategies of the two systems are striking. While Coleco is betting on conversions of some of the hottest arcade titles like Donkey Kong, Zaxxon, and Turbo, as well as the hottest cartoon craze, the Smurfs, Atari is relying on the name recognition of its biggest VCS hits, for example, Super Breakout, Pac-Man, Missile Command, Asteroids, and Star Raiders. The only game that hasn't already been on the 2600 of their home computers is Galaxian.
Yet another of Atari's extremely baffling decisions with the 5200. They did not launch it with a must-have game. All of these other games have been on the VCS and the Atari 8-bit.
It is a baffling decision. It's almost as if, they're like, well, you liked this game before, now you'll like it again. And but we just talked about how their arcade output has begun to really, really suck. They've been buying licensed games from overseas, Dig Dug, Kangaroo. It's as if the ideas have just kind of vanished, and they're bringing this out. It doesn't make any sense.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case. Whether or not their particular games that they were putting out in this period were the most popular of the time, I don't think that so much matters, because they were already licensing from other companies even when they had the biggest hits. Defender and Asteroids come out around the same time on the VCS. So
I meant licensing in the arcades.
Yeah. Defender and Asteroids, both very big hits in the arcade from...
No. I meant Atari was licensing arcade games for the arcades. So Kangaroo and Dig Dug.
Yeah, and they later convert them to the VCS, but it takes over a year to do that.
Yeah.
So what they are going to produce, what they would be able to produce for their systems in 1982 were the big games of 1981. But they still didn't do that. They decided the pack-in title for the 5200 is Super Breakout, a game from 1978.
It doesn't make any sense.
Make your arguments whether it's technology or whether they're running out of ideas. But I just think marketing-wise, they're making a very poor decision. And, of course, the big things they're dumping their marketing into are movie licenses. Where we'll get to that. Oh yeah. We've already mentioned a month or two ago that they got the ET license, and we'll know where that will take them. But yeah. And it's especially futile because they already have a way to get the older games onto their new system, because Atari announces 2600 emulator for 5200, but I have to object, it is not an emulator.
Okay, it's just a system on a chip, I'm guessing.
Yes, that is exactly what it is.
After Coleco announced an adapter to play VCS games on the ColecoVision, and parents across America were outraged that Atari's new console wouldn't be backwards compatible with all the games they already bought, the Atari VCS cartridge adapter for the 2600 has been announced. Oh, for the 5200 has been announced. So yeah, you're going to be able to play those 2600 games. Well, now the VCS has been christened the 2600 on your 5200. Woo-hoo!
As if you would ever want to. I don't think that even in today's collecting circles that this adapter is very much in demand.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. What would be the point? I mean, VCSs are like grains of sand on the beach. And but it is a sign of the times, because Mattel also releases a VCS adapter in early '83 for the Intellivision. I mean, everybody needs to have a VCS adapter at this point,
because they saw that market still growing, and it's a futile endeavor. But speaking of that VCS adapter for the Intellivision, Intellivision 2 announced, but it's not what you think.
Exactly. Mattel has announced that a new model of the Intellivision with a smaller case will be coming soon. The new model will not only provide cost reduction, but will also have a 2600 adapter available for it, which won't be compatible with existing Intellivisions without a hardware modification done by Mattel's service department.
I don't think that I have actually handled an Intellivision 2, but I have heard from some people that the controllers are a bit nicer.
Well, that's, number one, not difficult because the original controller sucks. But yes, it is basically fixing a lot of the problems from the original system. But I mean, the Intellivision is 70s technology, so it should be slightly improved at this point.
Or at least they're just trying to make it cheaper, Christmas, because it is the most expensive on the market, $269. I don't think that price has really changed from $79.
No, and they need those cost reductions because the competition's getting worse, but they're going to miss Christmas. So it's game over, man. Game over.
There's something else that has been missing from Mattel for a long time. Mattel drops Intellivision keyboard.
Mattel Electronics has decided not to expand sales of the Intellivision keyboard component, which would turn the console into a full-fledged home computer after the New Orleans and Seattle test markets, because, quote, the current pricing of the Intellivision keyboard component is not competitive in this rapidly changing market, end quote.
It is also very possible, that... So Mattel, from the very early stages of the Intellivision, wanted to have this keyboard add-on. I mean, you've gone through all the things that they did with advertising it and whatnot, But they are already thinking what they're going to do for a successor. And for that successor, they want more computer functionality. They have been looking into stuff very, very aggressively, and are starting to do designs with it. So I think the Intellivision keyboard was just there to take a loss because of the FCC stuff.
Well, yes. My interview with Don Daglow, because he was originally brought into Intellivision, to the Mattel Electronics Group to write programs for the keyboard, right when the system was just getting going, and it almost immediately becomes clear that the keyboard is going nowhere, years before it actually launches. So it. I think they actually intended for that conversion. Remember, the 79, 80 is the period when everybody's talking about, the consoles are just a transition product and will simply die on the vine, shrivel up like grapes as home computers replace them. And that's still the talk in some of these articles at this point in time.
There was kind of a break between those two periods, though. From between 79 and 82, the idea of the home computer kind of, that idea of it supplanting video games kind of went away. That's actually the topic of the next big They Create Worlds episode.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that because at this point in time, there is still a lot of push by some people especially the toy trade magazines, where they're debating, do we get another Christmas out of the VCS, or do we have to just stock VIC-20s? And that's a real argument that they seem to be having at this time. And so I think Mattel wanted to keep pushing it through, and it also explains their later launch of the Aquarius. Well, there's a lot of things that are inexplicable about the launch of the Aquarius, but that idea that the home computer is where it's at, and why there's no real successor to the Intellivision on a hardware on a hardware front, is all part of that. And the article that I used as the basis for this story here also already mentions that some of the financial analysts are speculating that Mattel may introduce a home computer in January or February, and they will.
I will say I have actually touched a Intellivision keyboard. I remember back in the day I used to hear about it. It's like people didn't even know if it actually got released in some capacity at all. But I have seen one. I have typed on it.
And
it's
good,
fine.
Bad, ugly.
I mean, it's a fine enough keyboard, but I'm sure all that I've heard about the functionality of it as a computer is that it's not good. So, but yeah, I don't delve into things on that level. I'll tell. But there is a particular console of which we should all have great interest. Vectrex, and Milton Bradley has bought GCE.
Milton Bradley, after reporting weak earnings due in large part to a strong dollar affecting its overseas operations, has gone headfirst into video games by acquiring GCE, the company that just debuted the Vectrex console at CES. GCE, chaired by Ed Krakauer, formerly of Mattel, will now operate as a subsidiary of MB.
They don't get much out of GCE because... GCE was just kind of a final production stage kind of company because the Vectrex was made by an outside firm, and then they decided to kind of take it and market it. So I don't know what their idea was with buying GCE, but I guess that gave them technically a electronics brand.
Yeah, it also may have been easier than having to funnel money into GCE for whatever operations GCE needed, or it could have just been, okay, GCE people, here's a bunch of stock, and we don't actually have to spend any cash in some kind of contract to buy units from you to redistribute. There's a variety of reasons why just buying the company may have been easier. But yeah, so they bought it. The Vectrex is going to, the next batch of Vectrexes are going to come out with the MB logos on them.
Because there are GCE Vectrexes out there.
Yes. And as somebody who has played the Vectrex, it's a very interesting little device. And it's one of those things that also happened.
Other toy companies having a good time in the video game industry. Parker Brothers predicts $200 million in video game sales.
Board game titan Parker Brothers has predicted revenues of over $200 million over the next 2 years from their video game sales. This will largely come from their Star Wars license, the first game of which is Empire Strikes Back for the VCS.
Maybe they got that amount, but any prediction that happens in 1982, you can basically say, nope, didn't happen.
For more details on this, I interviewed Tom Dusenberry, who was there at the time. He goes into quite great detail about what they were planning, what they did, what they couldn't do, and so forth. Very good interview. Link is in the show notes. So, but yeah, they're really hoping that this is going to be big. Now they have other stuff. They've got Frogger is theirs. Popeye from Nintendo is theirs. Hubert. Yeah, they get a whole bunch of. Gyrus is also there, and they will also port a lot of these games to home computers. So, they're going to be in the game for at least a little bit longer, but it's never going to be as successful as they were hoping. And talking about people who weren't as successful as they were hoping.
One of my favorites. Every time I hear them, I am elated with joy in a very perverse way. Games by Apollo expands.
The upstart third party is going all in. 7 new VCS games should be hitting store shelves in September alone from the Texas publisher. They are also building a new 75,000 square foot plant and plan to introduce 18 new games at the January CES, 6 of which will be for the VCS.
I'm not going to spoil anything, but Games by Apollo are the canary in the coal mine.
Yes, they are. In previous episodes, we've talked about how they sign deals for these massive ad campaigns. They want to rival Atari and Activision from nothing on ads and, just market presence. And their games all suck terribly.
I would recommend, if you go to Video Game History Foundation, gamehistory.org, the piece on Wabbit covers Games by Apollo rather extensively in terms of the ultimate fate of the company.
That I'll put a link to that in the show notes because, yeah. Now, Games by Apollo is not the only canary in the coal mine. There's a bunch of other companies releasing multiple titles this month. In the build-up to the Christmas glut, SpectraVision releases 2 more games on top of the ones that they've already got out there. It's just, yeah.
SpectraVision won't be closing that quickly, though.
No, they'll be around slightly longer, but not much. I think they last until, 84?
I don't recall exactly.
Yeah.
But while Games by Apollo, their first set of games, their very first game was a dud and a disaster because of a defect within the cartridge. Mattel also ships defect cartridges.
Thank you. Yeah, and we talked about the defective Games by Apollo carts a couple months back. Now, Mattel's first batch of VCS carts in their M Network line have proven defective. Yeah, some of the carts suffer from faulty circuit boards, others won't play on the original VCS model, but the biggest problem is that the plastic housing of many carts are too big to fit in a VCS. Mattel is asking people to return the carts and says the errors have been corrected.
You know, this is part of the reason why they had to have like a month and a half ahead of time to ship ET, so that they wouldn't run into stuff like this.
And it's kind of sad that this is even an option, but yes. And the problem with the original VCS that where in the newer models, I think one of the switches was on the back of the device as opposed to the front, and was causing problems for whatever reason. We've talked about that error before. It's popping up again. It will pop up again and again after this too.
And you know, I don't think that these kind of technical problems really dissuaded consumers as much as they did retailers, because, you know, if people are bringing stuff back to the retailers, especially back in those days, then that becomes a big problem for Mattel in that sense. But I think people were still willing to buy games even if they got something defective, because it was pretty rare to get something defective like that in an entertainment product, whereas, you know, you could get a defective vacuum and you'd still have to keep it.
That's true, but I think there's also the cost to the retailer is not just people getting ticked off or something. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the retailers are already a little skeptical, since most of them don't understand this product. And if somebody comes back, I mean, with a G.I. Joe figure and the arm fell off, they can understand that. Somebody comes back and says, this game won't work. Well, do you give them their money back? Or maybe they played it and they just didn't like it. I mean, and imagine it's the problem with the VCS, where it's like, oh, it didn't work on my VCS. And the toy store, who's only been selling games for 6 months, only has new VCSs. They pop it in and says, it works just fine. You must be lying. There's all sorts of issues here that are kind of scary for a toy retailer, since the price tag on these things is so much higher than they're normally used to. I think that that's also a big, big concern for them. They're starting to get jittery about the quality of the product.
We have some other concerns, Carl, coming in fast.
Okay, hit me.
Porn and horror come to the VCS.
American Multiple Industries, what a wonderful name for a holding company, has teamed up with porn producer Caballero Control Corporation. What's the Caballero in control over? Okay. To release a line of pornographic games for the VCS. They hope to get 3 games ready by October, with an additional 4 to be released in January. They also hope to port the games to Intellivision, home computers, and even license them for coin-op. Now, that's the porn side. On the horror side, Wizard Video, a mail-order videotape distributor specializing in horror films, has announced that they will be releasing games based on horror movies.
So if you want to know all about American Multiple Industries and Caballero Control Corporation, which I'm glad you got those right, because everybody nowadays says Mystique, which is not the name of the company.
No.
Kate Willert did both an article and a video very extensively covering what is the deal behind these companies. They were basically all holding companies, but how it all fits together is very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I did a little bit of research into that as well, and it is interesting, especially because of the way that, porn was distributed back then. It's quite fascinating. But yeah, the idea that they were going to make a porn game on a VCS with the graphical capabilities of the VCS is already laughable. The extremely offensive nature of some of the games, most notoriously Custer's Revenge, is just legendary. I don't think we need to talk about it here. Anybody who doesn't know what that is, Google it. I'll put a
or
link to the
video.
Moby Games entry. Yeah, or watch the video. It's just terrible on all levels. And now Wizard Video is a little bit more interesting, and it parallels in some ways what will happen a year or two later with Palace Video in the UK. There's the video. We have to remember at this point in time, a lot of studios are still wary about home video cassettes. The video cassettes that are out there are often from smaller independent studios because everybody's afraid of piracy, and buying a video cassette is not, a $10 deal. It's more like a $60 or $70 deal, and people are still paying it because, what else are you going to do with your VCR? This is the time period. Are you familiar with Troma?
Yeah.
Troma is an independent film producer that does they do a lot of distribution for other people. Like they did Trey Parker and Matt Stone's first movie, Cannibal the Musical. They brought that out. But they also do a lot of their own weird horror movies, stuff like The Toxic Avenger, Sergeant Kabuki Man, Poultrygeist, which is still one of my all-time favorites. There's basically, imagine tongue-in-cheek horror, comedy, splatter films with zero budget. But during this period of time, they make a ton of money, and they actually are able to do somewhat larger, more elaborate productions because they're making money off these videotape sales. So Wizard Video is one of these companies that is distributing movies like the Troma films, and they release a handful of games, actually two, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween. So they got the licenses to both of those. And they're interesting games because they actually do try to adapt the plot lines a bit. It's very weird. But interesting to see how you could almost call it Sillywood 0.05, like pre-beta version of Sillywood. And trying
it does become a trend. You have people like Gulf and Western, Paramount, starting to do more extensive Star Trek licensing. Also, did they also try to do the Halloween thing? I forget if they owned that. But whatever the case, both of these things, the encroaching into children's entertainment, become controversial. So you're getting a preview of what will happen in 10 years from now.
Oh, definitely. Next week, we are going to go headlong into the first round of that. But yeah, so it's interesting to see how this is evolving and who the players are and how diverse the origin of those players. Everything from toy companies to porn producers are getting in on the VCS market because it's count up to the crash.
But you know how you get ahead of everybody else, Carl? Merchandising. Oh, no, advertising. Advertising seen as key to video game sales.
With some estimating that over 300 VCS games will be on the market by Christmas 1982, just putting a game on the shelf won't be enough. Trade publications are big on the question of advertising, both for games and toys, and many are wondering how many of the new players will be able to pony up the cash and resources to gain sufficient consumer attention to stand out. Friend of the show Michael Katz, VP at Coleco, says that he expects a major shakeout after Christmas, with most of the hardware and software makers dropping out either completely or moving into the computer space.
Maybe a couple months after Christmas, but not a bad estimation, Katz. Oh, no. And then he's going to jump ship to a computer company, so I guess he knew what he was doing.
Oh yeah, and it's interesting here. This is actually this quote from Cats is taken from this piece where they have it's Cats from Coleco. I can't remember. It may have even been Games by Apollo, one of these other third-party guys, and a guy who I've never heard of his company before. It doesn't exist anymore, but apparently at the time he was a major East Coast toy distributor. So he was, buying the toys from the manufacturers and selling them off to individual retailers. And that guy's quotes are absolutely brilliant because he's just like, we're not touching video games. I have none of them in my inventory. This is the electronics crap from 2 years ago. We're staying out of it. Which I thought was a very interesting and insightful perspective. Now, I still have the contention that a lot of the retailers who went deep into video games at this point were being driven by FOMO, fear of missing out. But yeah, so it was interesting to see that there was real skeptical voices here leading up to this crash.
But sometimes to advertise, you gotta merchandise. So how about Data Age? They're giving away a free audio record.
A Data Age is promoting its lineup of 5 games for the VCS with a free 3.5-inch record that includes elements of each game plus electronic music composed by Craig Hundley of Star Trek The Motion Picture and Black Hole fame with use of his blaster beam instrument.
You're making this sound way more interesting than it is, Carl. I have listened to this several times as I've come across it in the magazines, and I have to keep mentioning, there is this weird record. It's a 7-inch. It's only 3 minutes long. It's 3.5 inch, as you say on here. So you have to run your record player to half speed. All right. I don't know. I forget how records work sometimes, even though I have a record player over there. But it's just advertising. It's entirely advertising.
Yeah. And it's nothing more than that. But again, it's and there's a weird phrase that took me a while to get used to in the toy trades, where they distinguish 2 categories of toys. There's regular toys, and then there's the TV advertised toys. And it's like any toy that gets advertised on TV has completely different expectations, completely different sales goals, and so forth. And so this idea of how important advertising is something that these retailers are keenly aware of. And so seeing a company like Data Age that probably doesn't have the money to do, big TV ads and stuff, trying to pull this kind of trick is really kind of cool.
All right, I have no transition for this next one.
Yeah.
Bruce Davis named VP of Legal Affairs for Imagic.
The third-party publisher has named lawyer Bruce Davis their new VP of Legal Affairs, starting a career in the tech industry that would continue to 2021.
One of the most controversial executives to ever be involved with the video game industry, and even one of the most controversial involved with Activision, which you think would be a hard play. But when you bring in Godwin's Law to describe somebody, then you know that there's some hatred going around.
What's Godwin's Law?
Godwin's Law is that in the amount of time that you talk to somebody, eventually people will start talking about comparing things to Nazis. So in Bruce Davis's case, in regards to Activision, they wrote up in regards to Infocom in particular, they wrote up a very very not flattering little joke memo of the Bruce Davis youth. Wow. Yeah, it's really mean-spirited. I mean, they hated him so bad. As Alex Smith, who has talked to Bruce Davis, has tried to rehabilitate his image to a certain degree. He was brought into a Magic as just a general lawyer, and then he was told to start working on their IPO, which he had never done before. So it was entirely new for him. And it's probably a reason why they got pretty late on that IPO, because he had never done it before. But, he's the legal affair guy, so he has to work on it. And then later he will become head of a magic when it dies, and then he will become part of the board for Activision and then take it over when Jim Levy leaves.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I wanted to include it here, just because it's like the first time he's showing up in one of these companies. And we have spoken about him previously in the lead up to Bobby Kotick taking over Activision, but yeah. So here he is.
There he is. Next up, Atari teams up with Mickey D's.
McDonald's is launching the Taste the Thrill of Atari promotion. 500 million scratch and win tickets themed after Asteroid, Centipede, Missile Command, and Star Raiders are going to be handed out to those buying meals at the fast food chain. Prizes range from rebates on games to computers, consoles, and even 200 Cabaret Centipede cabinets.
I guess they didn't sell many of those.
No, they didn't. Yeah, those Cabaret cabinets did not go over well. For some reason, fancy restaurants didn't want to have an arcade cabinet in the corner. Go figure.
Well, I mean, they were going off of the experience of the cocktail cabinets back in the day, which will be really fun to cover in 2024. I'll tell you. Yeah, I remember playing some of these scratch and win stuff from McDonald's. I don't know if they do them anymore.
Yeah, I don't know either. I actually remember when I first saw this, I was like, I don't remember this. And then when I saw the artwork, I do remember this as a kid. I don't think I ever played it because I think you only got it if you ordered certain foods back then, and they weren't the things that I was ordering as a kid. But yeah.
If you ain't getting McNuggets, what are you getting? Like, really?
Yeah, I never liked McNuggets. I really don't like McNuggets. They taste like styrofoam.
Exactly. That's why they're so great. Okay, next story. Palmtex gets Game & Watch rights.
Nintendo still hasn't moved into selling their Game & Watch games in North America, but have now moved the line from Migo to Palmtex. They will carry 7 of the games, including 2 dual-screen units, Oil Panic, and Donkey Kong.
For some reason, Nintendo has been having some real problems trying to get the Game & Watch into North America. I mean, I get in the sense that their North American subsidiary wasn't set up for this, but their games are good. Like, you think that they would have had at least some kind of good penetration, but they keep handing them to these no-name companies that nobody knows anything about.
Migo? Migo's huge. Migo going into the 1980s is absolutely... They've got the license for the action figures for Marvel, DC, and Dukes of Hazzard. They're the biggest thing out there in the toy aisle for boys.
I'll dispute you on that.
The only thing that kills them is Star Wars. And that's where they start falling on their face, because now they passed on Star Wars. And because they didn't see the value in doing smaller figures, because their big figures, their posable figures, were very similar to the original G.I. Joes, and they did not shift to smaller size fast enough. Sorry, the history of Migo is a fascinating one, because it's like they had the 70s, they owned the 70s for the most part. And then just in the 80s, they're just collapsing because they cannot catch a break. They try a whole bunch of different things that all fail, and they should have been the shoe-ins for Game & Watch, and somehow they just can't get it off the ground. Yeah. Now,
I know nothing about Palmtex.
Palmtex is one that I also couldn't find anything on. The fact that they got it makes no sense. Well, yeah, it doesn't make any sense that there's a Donkey Kong license in here. If it had been any other set of games, I would have been like, okay, yeah. But Donkey Kong, I mean, the fact that Coleco let that pass them by is kind of astonishing.
Well, they made the tabletop, but they didn't, the handheld market in general is down. Like the tabletop ones aren't really handhelds in the traditional sense. So I can understand why they wouldn't bother with that, though. How the rights work out, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing. Now, interestingly enough, there's another line of games that looks eerily like the Game & Watch called Thumbpower. And it's the name that a U.S. importer marketing line by Masudaya, and I'm probably killing the name of that, which is another Japanese company, and they're making these games that look eerily identical to Game & Watch. They even still
there
have
were
the
a lot
watch
of
function.
Game & Watch clones out there. That's part of the reason why Nintendo wasn't fully able to capitalize on Game & Watch, but not the whole reason. So, I don't know why they failed so hard.
Yeah,
Speaking of failing really hard, TI rebate hits stocks.
Texas Instruments $100 rebate plan for their TI 99-4A computer has spooked Wall Street. And we talked about this last month. So TI, Tandy, Warner Communications, Commodore, and IBM stocks all lost value as the market sees the move as a sign the profitability of home computer industry may be about to collapse. TI, through their national merchandise manager, Bob Gerwer, I think I'm pronouncing that right, claims that TI sees the computer market as a razor and razor blade model, with the hardware being the gateway to software sales, and thus the price drop of the hardware won't impact the long-term viability of TI's computers.
Yeah, that doesn't really work when you don't have full control over the software market like Atari does.
Well, and this is the thing. The TI 99-4A was famous for having that cartridge slot right in the front. And they were launching most of the software on cartridges. Mm-hmm. And they were basically the only ones making software for it because for the most part you had to do everything else on cassette when everybody had already been moving to disk drives. So TI thought that they were going to be able to hold on to their software production long enough to do this because they weren't really expecting too many computer software makers. They didn't see them moving into the cartridge space. And unfortunately, the gigantic growth of the VCS market meant that there were suddenly a ton of companies that knew how to make cartridges. And the VIC-20's massive sales. And the VIC-20 had so little memory in it that you had to put the software on cartridge to make it usable, meant that the software companies were quickly learning how to do cartridge software. So that's going to impact them. Now, that's not going to kill TI. What's going to kill
somebody
TI,
else coming up behind them.
Yeah, there's somebody who's going to basically be very aggressive in their pricing. Yes.
Commodore cuts wholesale prices.
Keeping up with the aggressive pricing in the hardware market, Commodore has announced $25 to $40 off on the wholesale price of the VIC-20 to retailers placing big orders.
I will again refer to the as yet out episode of They Create Worlds, which is going to cover the home computer price wars.
Exactly. And here, this is also the origin of the almost mythical idea that Jack Tramiel screwed over the small Commodore dealers for the benefit of the big mass retailers. This is one of these moves where suddenly if you're ordering a whole bunch of VIC-20s, you're going to get a larger rebate. And a lot of the smaller dealers who had been pet dealers for this will see this move as Commodore betraying them. And
they did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's giving them a mass discount. And my interview with Leonard Trammell, we talk about this. And one of the issues here is that in order to get it into the big retailers, they had to make the price really, really cheap. Now, people, once they had the computer, were going to be going to the small shops for support, for software, for classes, and all this other stuff. So in reality, the smaller dealers should have been reshifting away from the sale of the actual hardware to these ancillary services and leave the hardware that didn't have great margins to begin with anyway to the big box stores. But
woulda, coulda, shoulda. They
didn't. Yeah.
Nah, well, I would more argue that the dictates of the market aren't for one company to decide. But in the case of Intel, they do get to decide. For Intel introduces the 286.
Oh, very nice transition there. With the IBM PC, with the IBM PC making the market for the 8086 a reality, Intel has decided to go all in with the 8186 and 8286. Each incorporates massive numbers of new ancillary chips and much faster clock speeds over the 8086.
So this begins the numbering system that made sense at one time and now no longer makes sense.
Well, yes, this is that move. Also, it doesn't make any sense because
I am aware of the Pentium thing.
You can't copyright a number. Yeah.
But regardless, we live in the 86-driven world.
Oh, definitely. This is the moment when they introduce a new chip that's backwards compatible with the previous chips. It'll still run the old software, no modifications necessary, but keeps adding more functions and faster speed.
There is another layer to that, though. And MS-DOS is paving the way, for it is the new CP/M.
At the Sabit show in Hanover, Japanese computer manufacturers showed off many machines that were running Microsoft's MS-DOS. Intel's 8086 and 8088 chips dominated, although the Motorola 68000 also had a few users. Hitachi goes so far as to announce that they have made a machine compatible with the IBM PC.
That's pretty early for a Japanese clone maker. I don't really know much about when Japan got on board with the IBM PC thing for office use and whatnot. So that's a surprise to me if Hitachi actually puts that out in some time soon.
Well, and that's the weird thing here. Now, they're announcing that they've made a compatible machine. Now, we have to take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. So when they say compatible machine, they're not necessarily talking about compatibility with all the software. So couple of notes here from the articles, and if you check the show notes, there's a lot of links here. So computer maker Vector Graphics also introduces a machine that's the Vector 4, and it's using dual Z80As and an 8088 chip in addition, so it can run CP/M and MS-DOS. But it's not hardware compatible with the IBM PC, as it uses the S100 bus, and it would be the next year the Vector 4S that the machine could read IBM formatted disks. And this is where there's not a lot of explanation about the Hitachi machine, and I couldn't find an actual released machine of theirs that was actually 100% IBM compatible. But what is definitely happening here is everyone wants to run MS-DOS. What they're not able to run are the PC formatted disks. So that seems to be the one big stumbling block here.
Just to clarify, Vector Graphics is not a Japanese company.
No, it's not. It's not. I use that as an example of what compatibility means at this point. Sorry, should have clarified that.
They are an interesting company. Really have nothing to do with vectors. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, no, nothing. Who knows? Maybe it's the vector of great ideas and high tech, or who knows?
Okay, Carl.
Maybe they're going for some bigger idea. But what
they're
we're
an
seeing
interesting
here
company,
is,
though.
Yeah. What we're seeing here is the IBM PC, which has just really been introduced, is very quickly going to become, the inspiration for many other compatible machines. They're coming.
There are also other deviations that are expanding out, for Tandy expands beyond Radio Shack.
Tandy has decided to market their TRS-80 color computer, the Coleco, outside of their Radio Shack retail stores. This move is to counter the expansion of home computers into mass-market stores like Kmart and Montgomery Ward by Atari and Commodore. Compute Magazine estimates that a combined 200,000 consumer computers a month are now hitting U.S. retail shelves from the various manufacturers.
Not going to help them in the long run. They will do much better just by sticking to their stores and making IBM PC compatibles.
And this is the problem. The Trash 80, the original when first introduced in the 70s, great machine, cost-benefit analysis.
It's called trash for a reason.
It was called trash just because it didn't have the pretty graphics, and the Apple people were like, ha ha.
No. Users called it trash. Anyway.
Yeah, but it was the workhorse computer of its day. And the Coleco is an absolute freaking mess on many, many levels. And so,
well built.
As in, you could drop it from a third-story window and it might still work. But it's a problem because, number one, it's not compatible with any other systems, including the original TRS-80. And
that was just a marketing faux pas. They were never intending to make it compatible.
Oh, I know, but when you do this, people start getting the wrong impression. And when you did come into the store wanting to buy a Coleco, well, it's not really, as the English would say, it didn't do what it said on the tin.
I mean, they are trying to get into this home computer battle as the VIC-20 and the TI-99 foray. They were actually earlier than the other two on that front. Though another company is not looking to get into the middle of that, for Atari is teasing a new computer.
Ray Kassar, head of Atari, has teased in an interview that Atari's next computer will be out in January, have more memory than the Atari 400, but won't be getting involved with the $99 rat race. He also says that he believes some people just want to play games, so the price war in home computers won't impact consoles.
It won't to a large degree, even though we can look at these kind of corresponding factors and try and claim that the video game market went down because the computer market went up. In a large part, it didn't, because people were investing in home computers for something much greater, whereas the games were just seen as a luxury device.
Yeah. And it is interesting to see how he wants to keep those two areas separate, I guess, or he doesn't see them as interacting with one another. So this is him really taking the stance. That whole idea of, consoles are the gateway drug to computers, or we need to make the computers more console-like, or the consoles more computer-like, and so forth, is kind of a good distinction. I mean, it's a good recognition of how the machines are being used, but if he's not going to enter the price war, the Atari, I don't know how he's going to compete with the IBM PC.
I mean, he wasn't seeing it as competing with the IBM PC. He was still seeing it as the Atari 8-bits because they weren't actually working on a new computer. They was just like the 800 XL and all that stuff. So they were doing a cost reduction thing, just like the Intellivision 2.
Yeah.
So they weren't thinking that it was competing with the home computer in the sense of the VIC-20 or the business computer in the sense of the IBM PC. They were seeing a middle ground in there, which didn't exist.
Exactly. So, I was about to say that did not exist. You were either going super, super cheap, or you were going with the IBM PC. Well, it's not true. There is a middle ground in this battle, and that's the Commodore 64 at $595.
But, and I mean, it's not going to be a record breaker this year. It only when it gets its price reductions. I mean, it basically becomes as cheap as the VIC-20. Like, they basically dumped their VIC-20 inventory, and now the Commodore 64 takes the place of the VIC-20.
That is true. Yeah. But I mean, even in this first year, I'd have to look at the numbers again. The 64 is going to move a lot of units.
Oh, it definitely will. But we are in the time of the floppy disk woes. But there is a new floppy disk on the street. Matsuda introduces the 3-inch floppy.
Yes, with Sony promoting its 3.5-inch floppy, a competing standard, the 3-inch disc by Matsushita, has been shown off at the National Computer Conference.
By this time, the standard density floppy disk of 1.44 megabytes, 5.25 inch, is already the standard. So now they are introducing they're not all double density, but basically this will become the double density floppy.
Well, have you ever seen a 3-inch disc?
I believe so.
Probably not in person. The only major computer to use them is the Amstrad CPC.
Oh, so I guess it's a 3.5 inch.
The 3.5 inch is the one you know.
Okay.
That's Sony's is the one that takes off. Matsushita's is going to be used in a handful of Japanese computers, and Amstrad buys them up, I believe, and I've only heard the story through people telling stories, but Amstrad started out and was always big on just, finding products, usually in Asia, that they could import on the cheap and just rebrand, and that's how they ended up with the 3-inch discs for the Amstrad. Was, he got the drives cheap enough that it was like, okay, cool, that becomes the drive for our new computer. And they're kind of awkward because they're not square. Like, the disc is still round, but there's an extra header on top, so they kind of have this rectangular shape to them.
Probably so people won't insert them wrong.
That's also possible, yeah.
But we are in the software world, and Creative Software buys Broderbund licenses. I know that was terrible, but,
yeah,
what I got.
No, it works. With the VIC-20 market being hot and the only really viable games medium being cartridges, the race is on to provide software. Creative Software, which has been releasing games since the late 70s, mainly for the Commodore PET, has licensed 3 games from Broderbund: Apple Panic, Choplifter, and Serpentine, for release as VIC-20 cartridges.
Another example of a computer company getting into the cartridge market without getting into the video game market.
Exactly. And this is also going to lead us to the almost collapse of Sierra and so many other companies.
But not Broderbund. They got out pretty fine.
Broderbund, as far as I know, never actually releases anything on cartridge.
They were going to, and they took venture funding for that. Venture funding. And they later paid it out when they went public.
Yeah. Let's see. Got a couple of notes here. Epix also announces their first cartridge game for the Atari line of computers, Alien Garden, and they're going to release a bunch more things like Jumpman Jr. and so forth. They stick with it for quite a while, actually.
Okay.
Culminating, of course, in the best-selling product of theirs for the Commodore, the Fast Load cartridge.
Well, yes, that was an entirely different thing. That really didn't have anything to do with just getting into the cartridge market.
No, but it was still basically just software. There's no hardware components or chips in that thing. It's just software. It's the Fast Load cartridge.
Erasing the high-speed lines. I'm sure everybody who knows the Commodore 64 knows that story.
Of course. And this was a way of trying to alleviate some of that pain.
Fun. Here's a bit more fun. IBM Charlie Chaplin ads appear.
IBM's famous Charlie Chaplin ads for the IBM PC make their first appearance in this month's Creative Computing magazine. The licensed appearance of Chaplin, played by a double, will become an iconic image for the machine for years to come.
I think it's more famously associated with the IBM PC Junior, but they did do it for the regular PC as well.
Yes. And this is where it starts. I mean, this is still when it was relatively simple, white background, Charlie, the little tramp, I should say. It's not Chaplin. It's little tramp, looking at the screen of a computer that's on a table, and that's it.
They are cute. They are fun.
Yeah.
I like Charlie Chaplin.
So do I.
All right. The Games Network wants your game.
Yes, we talked last month about the Games Channel, a startup that would be offering games via cable lines on a monthly flat fee basis. Well, CGW, Computer Gaming World, has a profile of the company this month, renamed the Games Network, and their plans are bigger, now with possibly 3 channels in the offering, and while still only in a playtest market in Southern California, they are accepting submissions for new games as they will need at least 80 for their full rollout.
There were so many tiny network services that were popping up around this time, and it's just so interesting, and basically those are all lost online communities. Somebody needs to write a book on this. Maybe I will. At some point.
Yeah. Well, and this one's really interesting. I've already got about 4 hours in on an interview with the co-founder, Larry Dunlap. And now the next session, we're going to be opening up his copy of the hardware that this was going to be using. It's an Apple II clone.
Okay.
Yeah. We're going to be opening it up and filming that, and that'll be a bonus on the Patreon.
So
we're actually going to be looking at the chips
at some point.
Oh yeah. Right now it's in his personal collection. He's got a whole bunch of materials on this on the machine and stuff. He's going to be he's scanned some of it already. He's going to be scanning some more. So when that interview does come out, I'm going to be adding links to a whole bunch of it, ancillary information on this. So it's been fun. The guy is super cool. He's written 2 books. He was a musician before that in a band. He was charting and stuff, and he's done a ton of different stuff in his life. And super fun guy. Really happy I met him. Already, like I said, about 4 hours into the interview. There's going to be a lot of stuff cut out because we've gone on so many weird tangents about other things. It's kind of funny, but that's going to be a great interview coming up. The entire Games Network / Games Channel saga of how the company almost happened will be fun to talk about.
So advertising for future content right here.
Yep. There's a lot going on in the background, people. Lots of stuff being recorded in the background.
And advertising for past content is the continued existence of this company, First Star Software. And it's being announced, which is a weird way to put that, Carl.
First Star Software announced. He took out a 1-page ad advertising that he's starting this company. So, Fernando Herrera, the first person to win an Atari Star Award for a program he wrote, has started his own company, First Star Software.
Oh.
Yeah. His first title will be Astro Chase, but First Star will ultimately be the company that brings us Boulder Dash and Spy vs. Spy.
And is it incredibly litigious about making sure nobody makes Boulder Dash clones.
Yeah, I've heard that. Although all the people who are making Boulder Dash add-ons are okay because he did release the construction kit.
So that's basically their legacy. They're not a big-time thing, and they shouldn't be caring about their old properties that much while not actually doing anything to update said properties. But hey, if you can make money.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, there have been a lot of officially licensed Boulder Dash games over the years. A lot of them. He's tried to bring it back again and again and again.
Yeah, but without quality. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those games that it works really well as a very simple puzzle. The moment you try to update the graphics too much, you get one of those, what was that terrible Bomberman game on the Xbox?
Zero.
Yeah, I mean, you get a situation where there's certain games where a higher resolution, more colors, more shades of colors and stuff just muddies the water and destroys it. Clear, clean, graphical look is timeless, but then also not really exciting for new players, or at least won't attract the new players. Once the new players are in, they'd probably love it. It's just, yeah.
Other new things in computer games. Online systems gets a name change.
Ken and Roberta Williams' company Online Systems has changed its name to Sierra Online Incorporated.
They did this at the behest of the venture capitalists who were invested with them, who didn't want such a generic name.
And this is probably good because there's a company that has an almost identical logo called Online Systems that's a hardware retailer that I've been seeing in the magazine since I started this show, and every time I see the logo, I'm like, is that them? Did they do something with that? And, yeah. So, no.
There's also a company in 75 called California Online Systems, which was doing something rather interesting, but we won't talk about that right now. Another name change, actually, you probably didn't even know this, but GameStar announces solo football.
In a video game first, GameStar has announced their new football game for the Atari 8-bit computers will allow for solo play against the computer.
Oh my god, AI!
Yeah. Now, you mentioned something about a name change?
Yes, GameStar was actually originally called Arcade Plus, or maybe it was technically a separate company. But either way, the original GameStar games were being marketed under this name, Arcade Plus. I didn't know this originally. Someone told me this. That you will find some ads for these early games being advertised for the Atari 8-bit, and those were in fact some of GameStar's first games.
Ah, very cool. Yeah, and I'm mentioning GameStar here primarily because, of course, Scott Orr, who founded the company, is going to go on to design the console version of Madden. We've talked about him 2 years ago now when he left EA under strained circumstances. No, when he leaves GameStar. He's going to leave GameStar, I think, in 1990 or early 91 to go over and start. First, he starts working as an independent contractor, does ABC Monday Night Football for Data East, and then later on goes on to do Madden for EA. And he does the Mega Drive version, so he's basically the one who adapts it for consoles. Also on the Amiga. Now, what was the lead design platform, Amiga or Mega Drive? I can't say, because both of the games look almost identical. But
what game are you talking about?
The original John Madden Football for the Genesis.
I mean, Genesis was the lead platform.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if that's what they developed it on. It comes out first on the Genesis, but the Amiga version is so identical that it
just
may have been...
It was
just a port.
Absolutely developed Genesis first, because it was supposed to be kind of their breakthrough game on Genesis.
Gotcha.
GameStar made a lot of very impressive stuff for the Atari 8, but that it was action and it had some depth to it and whatnot. And also on that same sort of line of future game creators who will make a name for themselves, Brian Fargo releases The Demon's Forge.
RPG guru Brian Fargo makes his commercial game debut in the pages of Computer Gaming World this month with The Demon's Forge, a text adventure with classic dungeon crawling flair.
I was extremely weirded out when in 2010 there was a game released called The Demon's Forge, and then I learned that it was that it was actually part of this franchise.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a 3D action game. I don't think it wasn't Interplay who published it, but Brian Fargo had something to do with it. That it was technically part of the franchise of Demon's Forge.
Oh, that is cool.
It apparently wasn't that great of a 3D action game, but it was like, wow, this is one of those instances where there's a franchise that goes back that far.
I mean, come on, the name is awesome. You have to give it that.
If it lives up to it. But I've never really looked at this game too deeply. And Brian Fargo, self-admittedly, is not much of a game creator. He was just a very good builder of a company who knew what good games were.
Yeah, and this game is really, really, its standout is the cover artwork.
Yeah, that is pretty cool.
The cover artwork of this is, it's not Frazetta, but it could be Frazetta.
Yeah, it's pretty high quality for that kind of game back in the day.
Yeah. So I don't know exactly how they pulled that off, how he got the money for those kind of rights, but, hey, good on him. And, of course, he's going to go off and do all sorts of fun stuff with Interplay.
It is a very strong visual impression for a text game. And on such a note, Invisiclues premiered.
The Zork Users Group has launched Invisiclues, the hint books that don't spoil anything by using invisible ink.
Probably the most clever thing that Infocom ever did.
They did a lot of clever things.
I'm talking mainly in the advertising space. I'm not talking about the games. I'm just in terms of them being able to provide stuff like, the feelies and whatnot, like other people did stuff like that. But the Invisiclues are pretty cool.
Oh yeah, they're awesome. And I interviewed the guy who was responsible for creating those, Michael Dornbrook. He came up with it because he had seen the same technology used by a professor at MIT who built his exams using this invisible ink. So, you would choose, the students would get these sheets with the exam questions, multiple choice, and then they would have to choose one answer, and they would then mark it with this pen, and it would appear on the thing as marked or not marked. So it was basically a way of doing multiple choice without a Scantron. And then he found out how to, he looked everywhere to find a printer who could print that, and built the Invisiclues around that. And my interview with Michael Dornbrook, definitely something you should check out. Link is in the show notes.
The analog approach to video game hint design. And Milton Bradley is in fact taking some games to analog.
While Coleco is hammering out electronic versions of arcade hits and Pac-Mania is coming to TV, Milton Bradley has purchased the rights to 3 hit games to make board games out of them. Pac-Man, Frogger, and Donkey Kong will all find new life in cardboard and plastic for wholesome family fun.
I've seen some people play these games. They are extremely basic. They're not really that interesting.
This is true. And I never played Frogger or Donkey Kong, but a buddy of mine had Pac-Man. And I remember we were playing it and just getting bored out of our minds. Especially weird because the Pac-Man that you control, each player gets a different colored Pac-Man. So, we were always fighting over who was going to have the yellow Pac-Man because the red and the blue and the green ones were quote-unquote fake Pac-Mans. And the other thing that was kind of weird was that they had teeth. It's like Pac-Man looks evil. The little Pac-Man character you control looks evil. And also the mechanism was set up in such a way that you're supposed to move him one spot at a time as you move around the board, and each of the dots is represented by a little white marble, and it's supposed to be picked up, and half the time that wouldn't work. But oh well. Okay. Keep moving.
On terrifying portrayals of Pac-Man, usually on the cover of these magazines. Video Game Magazine! Boom, hits.
Books aren't the only place you can read up on the latest games. Magazines are becoming a big part of game culture. This month alone, Joystick, from the same people who brought you How to Win at Pac-Man, Video Gaming, and Vidiot magazines premiere.
If you haven't followed me on Twitter, I've been going through these chronologically, the video game magazines. I've been behind on that, but I have done many of these issues.
Yeah, I saw you did a whole thing on Vidiot. Not necessarily the best magazine.
Oh yeah, that one really sucked. That was terrible. Speaking of things that are terrible, D&D movie in the works.
TSR has announced that they are getting into movies with James Goldman of The Lion in the Winter and Robin and Mariam fame writing a script for a D&D movie.
And of course it languishes forever, and then we get the very terrible one later. I think we've discussed this before. I personally don't think that a D&D movie needs to replicate the experience of D&D. I just want a fun fantasy movie that doesn't blow hard.
I cannot, I'm never going to say no to a fun fantasy movie that doesn't blow hard. But I also believe that the core of a D&D story has to be a small group of weird misfit characters who really probably shouldn't be together, having to go on quests together. So as long as you give me the structure of ragtag group of people with varying capabilities going on a quest together, I'll buy into it that it's D&D. And the weird thing here is that the script that was being worked on that Gary Gygax apparently during his life really, really loved has been leaked, or at least versions of it have been leaked. And I put links to it in the show notes. And it's terrible. It's absolutely freaking terrible. And I'm not sure whether or not it influenced things, but it feels a lot like the plot of the D&D cartoon. So it starts off with people from the real world getting sucked into the D&D world. And yeah, it's just not good. Very much.
There is a direct-to-streaming D&D movie coming out. Or maybe it already came out and I just didn't hear anything about it. But
you mean the one with the guy who played Kirk in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies? Chris Pine.
That him? Oh, well.
I
wasn't paying that close of attention because I thought it was also going to be bad. So maybe it's not. I don't know.
I don't know either. The trailer looked okay-ish, but didn't really reveal anything about plot or anything like that. Now, if you want halfway decent, the two D&D direct-to-DVD sequels were actually not all that bad. I mean, they're not good, but they're definitely watchable. I think it's something with a dragon lich. And the second one is Book of Vile Darkness. And that's actually fun because it follows an evil party. So they do have a paladin character who has to, go undercover with these evil characters to stop the end of the world. But it's, evil people being hired by super, super bad guy to do bad things. And it's actually quite entertaining. So.
Well, our very last story for today, Carl, we are also talking movies for E.T. merchandise. Anticipation is very great.
Oh, yeah, I saved this one for the end. E.T. Mania seems to have caught the merchandising world by surprise. Since the movie's release on June 11th, toy stores have been eagerly anticipating toys that have not shipped yet, and parents are frantically calling around for anything to satiate their kids' love of the sentient Spud. Tops... Oh, come on.
Well, you think what kind of potatoes are you eating, sir?
No. Haven't you? Okay. In the novelization of the thing, it is made very clear, and this was originally the concept. E.T. is an evolved plant. He's a plant. That's why he has that effect on plants. He is supposed to be an evolved plant. So he is a Spud.
Just keep going. Keep going. I don't want to think about this.
That's the lore of E.T.
I don't want to think about this. Keep going.
Okay. Topps Trading Cards, TI's E.T. Speak and Spell cartridge, and Putnam's Storybooks are hot sellers, but LJN and Kamar figures are yet to be seen at retail, despite TV news stories and interviews making consumers aware of them, and LJN taking out a full-page ad in trade magazine Toy and Hobby World announcing that they have a ton of product in the pipeline.
No idea what the holdup was, but they are going to make out pretty well on this deal, but not everybody is. I mean, you'll get there when you get there, but the E.T. merchandising mania never takes off to the same degree of success that the movie had.
Well, I think it's basically once the movie is out of theaters and you're just staring at this little clump of brown plastic, it's not very engaging. It's just kind of
E.T. was not toyetic.
No. Like I said,
classic style.
A sentient Spud. And
I told you to stop.
But it's true. It's so true. I still remember my mom used to make salt dough figures that she'd sell at, art fairs and things like this. And just as E.T. was getting huge, I remember her being up all night for this fair, and she's making these little E.T. ones where it's E.T.'s head and he's leaning over this heart, and it says, and then she painted on I heart E.T. or something. And that shit sold like hotcakes for a hot minute. And then it was gone again. And yeah, so come Christmas time, this fad will have left and it's going to be replaced by a whole bunch of other things. And I kind of wanted to talk about this because I consider this a major component of the post-Christmas crash, that there's a barrage of new toys starting to appear and gain steam. And this is a topic that's in all the toy trades for the last couple of months. G.I. Joe toys are selling like hotcakes. Masters of the Universe started out in a couple of test markets. It's now gone national, and they can't produce the toys fast enough. Strawberry Shortcake and the Smurfs are also everywhere. Even though Strawberry Shortcake has been around for a couple of years, G.I. Joe has been around for a couple of years, for 1 year prior to this. The Smurfs, the TV show, is becoming this super hot commodity on television. So there's going to be these rivals for the toy aisle in a way that for the last 5 years or so, there hasn't been a real standout product, especially in the boys category. There's been Dukes of Hazzard licenses and the Star Wars stuff, but the Star Wars stuff comes and goes as soon as the movies come and go. So this is going to really have an effect, I think, on the way toy retailers react to the crash.
Oh yeah, that was part of the reason that the electronic toys could wiggle their way in, because there was a gap for them to fill.
Oh yeah, definitely. And a couple other little notes here on the toy aisle. Donkey Kong plush toys are coming.
Those iconic ones where Donkey Kong looks really weird.
Yeah, well, he kind of looks like he does in... There's two artworks for the arcade cabinet. There's the flyer artwork where he looks really mean and he's at the top of the thing. And then there's the artwork from the side of the cabinet where he looks goofy. And that's the artwork that those dolls remind me of.
Oh, I know. I know the one you mean, but I still think it's weird.
Yeah, it is definitely weird. But it's also coming out...
Mainly because he's wearing a shirt. Why is he wearing a shirt?
I think that's probably the toy company taking artistic license, and also the fact that Donkey Kong Jr. is out at this point. So I think there may have been sort of a wires cross between, are we doing a Donkey Kong Jr. or a Donkey Kong toy, and they couldn't make up their minds. But that's just a wild theory of mine. And the other big thing, since we just talked about the Dukes of Hazzard being a big license, the Duke boys are suing Warner Brothers and have been replaced on the show. So this is the infamous season of the Dukes of Hazzard with the cousins who just happen to dress just like the original Duke boys and do all the same things, and it's a whole weird thing. So for one season...
You see, Carl really just wants to do a Toy History Time Machine podcast sometimes, so that's why he throws this in at the end, so we make sure that you all get it.
If I wanted everybody to get it, I'd put it at the start of the show. But yeah, no, I put it in there because I do think that since most of these game cartridges, this is all the period, we've got a couple of retailers that are more dedicated to games popping up around this time, but for the most part, these cartridges are going over the counter at toy stores. So it's important to know what that market looks like beyond games to understand the ability or willingness of the retailers to cut their losses and move away from games post this Christmas. And, if they were really dependent on it, they probably would have suffered through it more. But so many of them can just say, you know what, screw this, I'm going to sell a Castle Grayskull for the same price as a cartridge, and everything's cool. That is going to be the big killer.
Carl, do you think I've watched a single episode of Dukes of Hazzard? Really?
No, of course not. You're too young. And to be honest with you, I never watched an episode of Dukes of Hazzard until many, many years later. Never watched it as a kid. But
okay, before we get off on Carl's reminiscences, I think we're up to the end of the episode.
Yes, this is the end of the episode, which means the only task left is for our co-host to give us the word of the episode.
Well, because it came to mind, a spark of inspiration to help describe the ET merch here at the end, it shall be toyetic.
Toyetic, I love it. Okay, toyetic it is. So, everybody remember, follow us on the socials, hit subscribe, give us a like, 5-star review, whatever.
Give that come on,
finally.
We got it.
And follow us and support us on Patreon. $1 a month will get you access to all the cool extra content over there and early access to the interview episodes. And, if you've got any questions, send them our way. Email is videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. Okay, then in that case, and Ethan, where can everybody find your stuff?
At GameResearch_E. The history of how we play.wordpress.com, and Gaming Alexandria. Join the Discord, it's good fun.
Excellent. So, in that case, everybody, have fun.